We've all heard about scorned ex-lovers lashing out at their former partners when the relationship comes to an end. Today's story is about a very specific type of criminal that is often portrayed in horror movies, but who rarely exists in real life. However, as rare as they are, they do actually exist. And when they decide to wreak havoc, there's often very little anyone can do to stop them. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. At around 9:30 p.m. on Christmas Eve 1992, 18-year-old Denita Gallette finished up her shift at Rally's, a fast food hamburger restaurant in her hometown of Dayton, Ohio. She hung up her apron, she said goodbye to her coworkers, and then she stepped outside into the freezing 19-degree night air. Denita had not driven a car to work that day, so she pulled her plaid flannel jacket tightly around her to keep warm, and then she began to briskly walk in the direction of her mother's house, which was only a couple of miles away. That night, like every other Christmas Eve night, Denita's family had all gathered up at her mother's house to celebrate. The Gallettes were one of those big families that were very close and who always looked out for each other. When Denita had gotten pregnant when she was only 15 years old, she had told her parents and 7 siblings, all of whom were older than her, that she'd likely have to drop out of school and get a full-time job to provide for this child. But her family's reaction was, "Nonsense. We'll help you raise this baby so you can stay in school and get a good job and still have a great life." And sure enough, from the moment Denita gave birth to her daughter, her entire family stepped up and made themselves available to provide childcare anytime she needed them to. Fast forward a couple of years back to that Christmas Eve night in 1992, and since Denita had to work that shift at Rally's, her daughter, who was now 2 years old, had been spending the night with her family at her mother's house. And so as Denita walked, she suddenly had this urge to call her family and just check in to make sure her daughter was okay, and also just to give them a heads up that she would be there in the next 30 minutes or so. So at around 10 p.m., she stopped at a payphone on the side of the road that was only about a half mile from the Rally's restaurant. She fished some coins out of her pocket, she put them into the slot on the phone, and then she dialed her mother's phone number. As the phone rang, Denita likely was thinking about how much fun it was going to be to see everyone that night. She also likely was looking forward to eating some of her mother's famous chili and cornbread that she always made around this time of the year. At Denita's mother's house, her whole family was sitting around in the living room chatting and having a nice time, just waiting for Denita to arrive. At 10 p.m., when the phone rang in the house, immediately everyone in Denita's family assumed it had to be Denita calling to let them know that she was off work and that she would be home soon. So when the phone was ringing, one of Denita's siblings, Rhonda, she jumped up and she excitedly ran into the kitchen and she pulled the phone off the receiver and she said, "Hello?" expecting to hear her sister's very happy voice on the other end of the line, but instead she heard silence. Rhonda said, "Hello?" a few more times, but when she was still met with silence, she shrugged and put the receiver back into its cradle, and then she walked back into the living room and she told her family that no, it was not Denita, it must have been a wrong number. Denita's family would stay up for a little while longer waiting for Denita, but she never showed up, and they never actually spoke to her on the phone. Eventually, the family was so tired they decided to just go to bed for the night. They figured Denita must have gotten hung up at work, which was prone to happen, and so they would just have to wait until the next morning to celebrate the holidays with her. Around the time Denita stepped outside of the Rally's restaurant and began making her walk to her mother's house, Dayton, Ohio homicide detective Doyle Burke was finishing Christmas Eve dinner at his grandmother's house in the suburbs with his wife and their 2 young children. Like the Gallettes, the Burkes also liked to get together with family on Christmas Eve at Grandma's. But much as Detective Burke enjoyed the holidays, he'd been a homicide cop long enough to know that just about every week, at least one person got murdered in Dayton. And so chances were good at some point over the next couple of days, he'd be called into work. And sure enough, that Christmas Eve night, after they were done eating, his pager went off, and he looked at the incoming code and it said, "Call work immediately." When he looked up from his pager, he noticed his wife was staring at him. She knew the drill. She knew he would have to leave. When Detective Burke stepped away to call into work, he was told there had been a shooting on Neal Avenue. The victim had been found near a payphone located about a half-mile away from the Rally's restaurant. Detective Burke said goodbye to his family, he hopped in his car, and he headed over to Neal Avenue. When he got there, he saw a ring of police cars and medical personnel all standing in a circle around this payphone. Burke parked his car on a side street and then he walked over, and when he pushed past the ring of people, he saw the victim on the sidewalk right underneath the payphone. It was a young woman lying in a pool of her own frozen blood. It was Denita Gallette. She had been shot 5 times at point-blank range, bullets striking her in the chest, the legs, and the hands. The pattern of wounds on her body suggested she'd tried to shield herself from the bullets, holding up her hands and turning her head away and crouching back like she was trying not to get hit. After she was lying on the ground, either dying or dead, whoever had attacked her ripped her plaid coat off, they took her sneakers off, and they took her backpack that contained only 50 cents. Scattered around her body were .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, which immediately stood out to Burke. That type of ammunition was distinctive. It was generally only used for target shooting because it was not a very powerful ammunition. However, obviously, it was still lethal at close range. Witnesses in the area said they had heard the shots ring out and then saw 2 young men carrying pistols running away from the payphone. Shortly after Denita's family had decided to just go to bed and see Denita in the morning, they heard a knock on the front door. It was Detective Burke telling them that their Denita had been murdered. They were beyond devastated. They couldn't understand why anyone would ever want to harm Denita. She was such a happy person who everyone seemed to love. They just couldn't understand who would do this. When Burke told the family that Denita had been killed near a payphone, and according to witnesses, her murder likely happened sometime around 10 p.m., as soon as the family heard this, they all thought of that strange, silent phone call that Rhonda had answered around 10 p.m. that night. Had that actually been Denita? Had that been her killer? They didn't know, but it just seemed like too much of a coincidence that they would get a call at the same time that she was killed. After leaving the Gallette's household and filing his report on Denita's murder, Detective Burke arrived back at his home just hours before dawn on December 25th. After catching a quick nap, he spent that morning with his family celebrating Christmas, but his heart just wasn't in it. He had been investigating homicides for years, and so over time he had become somewhat desensitized to all of the violence. However, that morning he just kept thinking of Denita Gallette's grief-stricken family when he had told them the news. He also kept thinking about Denita herself, how scared she must have been when she was crouched down trying to shield herself from her attacker. Her family had shown Burke a picture of Denita when she was alive, and she looked like such a vibrant, happy young woman with this big, infectious smile. It just didn't make any sense that someone would kill her over some shoes and a jacket and a backpack with 50 cents in it. Was this actually a personal attack where they knew who Denita was and they were targeting her, and then afterwards they kind of set it up to look like a robbery? Or was this really a robbery? In which case, again, why are you killing someone over things that are worth so little? Burke kept finding himself thinking in circles about her case. He felt like there had to be more to this than met the eye. And he would be right. That night, just before 9 p.m. on Christmas Day, Burke's pager went off again. There had been another murder. This one had taken place in the northern part of Dayton, roughly 2.5 miles from where Denita had been found. The victim was 19-year-old Richmond Maddox. He was found slumped in the driver's seat of a blue Chevy Caprice that had crashed into a tree on the side of the road. But the crash hadn't killed him. What had killed him was a gunshot wound to the right side of his head, fired from point-blank range. And they searched the car. There was no weapon inside of the car, so this was not a suicide. And they checked the exterior of the car, and there was no entry point into the car from a bullet, which means the gun that shot him had been fired from inside the car. Likely, whoever was sitting in the passenger seat or in the back seat had shot this guy in the head. And considering the car had crashed into a tree, indicates that whoever did this, whoever pulled the trigger, had done it while Richmond was actively driving the car. And so in Burke's mind, this indicated that the person who did this had been forced to do this, because it's extremely dangerous to shoot the driver of the vehicle when the car is still moving, because you're going to crash. And so this person who shot Richmond must have been desperate. Maybe they had been kidnapped by Richmond and they were forced to do this. Burke didn't know, but that seemed like the most logical theory. When police spoke to witnesses in the area, they told the police that they heard the crash and then they looked outside and they saw what looked like a short young woman, probably a teenager, get up from the ground near the car and then start running away with a limp. Even though no shell casings were found in or around Richmond's car that could, in theory, link his murder to Denita's murder, Burke still had a hunch that these two murders had to be connected. They had occurred less than 24 hours apart, so back to back, and the bodies were found less than a couple miles apart. And in Burke's experience working in homicide, coincidences rarely occurred. Things happen for a reason. And in Burke's mind, he's thinking, these murders are connected. I just got to figure out what the connection is. But Detective Burke's investigation into Richmond Maddox's death only seemed to further complicate things. Richmond's family, who were stunned at the news of his murder, had no idea who would want to kill him, or who the girl fleeing the scene could possibly be. The only girl in Richmond's life that the family could think of that might have been in the car with him was his ex-girlfriend, 16-year-old Laura Taylor, who they described as being very sweet and polite. But when Burke went to Laura Taylor's house on the morning of December 26th to interview Laura, he was in for a shock. Laura had apparently not been home in several days, and her parents were very worried. Hearing that their daughter's ex-boyfriend had been killed, they feared the worst, that something terrible had also happened to Laura. But before Detective Burke could even begin to process this new information, that now, in addition to two strange murders, he also now had a missing juvenile, who very well could be the key to solving what was happening, unbelievably, while he's thinking about all these different things, Burke felt his pager vibrate again. There had been another shooting. This time inside of a mini-market convenience store that was only 3.5 miles south of where Richmond Maddox had been found. This time, there were two victims. Both were still alive, but they were in critical condition. 38-year-old Sarah Abraham was a classic American success story. After immigrating to the United States from war-torn Ethiopia, she and her family worked hard and established businesses in the Dayton area that included a restaurant and a few convenience stores. The convenience store where this shooting took place was the location where Sarah spent the majority of her time. On the day after Christmas, while Detective Burke was speaking to Laura Taylor's family, Sarah Abraham said goodbye to her 3 young children and then headed out the door to go open the convenience store for the day. Once she arrived and she opened the store and went inside, a 71-year-old regular named Jimmy Thompson came in and he stood by the register to chat with her about the holidays. And then at some point, a middle-aged man named Jones Pettis came inside as well, and he began browsing down one of the aisles. A few minutes later, a teenage girl came up to the register and tried to buy a pack of gum, but she was 5 cents short. Jimmy cheerfully reached into his pocket and gave her a nickel. She smiled, took the nickel, put it on the counter, and then she took the gum and walked out of the store. Then, a few minutes after the girl had left, 2 young men entered the store, each holding a pistol. Sarah and Jimmy immediately threw their hands up over their head, and Sarah told the gunman, take anything you want, we'll give you all the money we have, please just don't shoot us. One of the men barked at her to open the cash register and give them all of her money. And so with shaking hands, Sarah reached down and she opened the register, she pulled all the money out, she gave it to them, and then she kept her hands up. She had given them everything they had wanted. But for some reason, the man who had taken the money from her still raised his pistol up, he put it right in her face, and he fired 2 shots. One went straight through her mouth, and the other went through the top of her head. And then, after she collapsed to the ground, the men began shooting at Jimmy, But amazingly, they missed him despite being right in front of him. And Jimmy, who was thinking on his feet, immediately threw himself kind of over the counter and acted like he had been mortally wounded. And so the gunmen, believing Jimmy was down as well, they turned around and they began walking out of the store. But as they were leaving, they noticed Jones Pettis, who was trying to hide at the end of one of the aisles. And so they just fired at him, striking him in the hand and in the stomach. Then the two gunmen left, they hopped in a car, and they fled. Paramedics would rush Sarah Abraham and Jones Pettis to the hospital. Jones would survive, but Sarah would die from her injuries 5 days later. When Detective Burke arrived at the convenience store that morning, the other officers who were already on scene told him that Jimmy and Jones had not gotten a good look at the shooters. They just said that they were two young men and that they didn't recognize them. After being told this information, Burke stepped inside of the convenience store to have a look around. He was already operating on the idea that this attack had to be linked to Richmond Maddox and to Denita Gallette, because again, the proximity and time to the other murders was just too much to overlook. That couldn't be a coincidence. And sure enough, right as Burke stepped into the store, this hunch of his seemed to be confirmed, because on the blood-stained ground near the counter were several .25 caliber aluminum shell casings, the same distinctive ammunition type that was used in Denita's murder. At this point, Burke was fully convinced these murders had to be linked. But the victims didn't make sense. It would turn out none of the victims' families had ever heard of the other victims or their families. None of the victims worked together or went to school together or had any interaction at all. It just seemed like the victims were kind of random. But as Burke and his partners were discussing how these crimes could be linked, Burke got yet another call. There had just been an attempted shooting at a Dayton gas station. When Burke arrived, they found this hysterical woman named Kathy Henderson, who earlier had been putting air in the tires of her black 1989 Dodge Shadow. When two young men pull into the parking lot, they hop out of the car and they walk right up to her. They raise their guns at her, and then one of them says, "You're gonna die today." And then the two men just started shooting at her. And amazingly, she managed to not get shot and she was able to run to safety, but the two men stole her car. The bullet casings that were found at the scene of this crime were, unsurprisingly, the same distinctive aluminum variety. Clearly, whoever was behind all of these shootings was not showing any signs of slowing down. And so by now, the shootings in Dayton had attracted so much attention that it was not only all over the local media, but it was all over the national media. This was all anybody in the country was talking about, that there was just these rogue people running around Dayton shooting random people, and the police apparently couldn't stop them. And so panic was spreading like a wave amongst Dayton residents and surrounding areas. It didn't seem to matter who you were or what you were doing. Suddenly, everyone felt like they could be next. On the evening of December 26th, shortly after Kathy Henderson's carjacking was reported, Dayton Police Sergeant John Huber was in his patrol car cruising the northwest neighborhood of Dayton when an all-points bulletin came across his radio. The dispatcher said to be on the lookout for the 1989 Dodge Shadow that Kathy Henderson had stolen, and that if they found it, be advised because the occupants were likely the same people perpetrating all of these shootings all over town, and so they were likely armed and dangerous. Huber had developed a knack for finding stolen cars in Dayton. He knew where all the little cutouts were and back alleys were where people like to stash their stolen cars, and so he decided he would just go looking for the Dodge Shadow. And after only being on the hunt for about 20 minutes, he looked down a dark, quiet street just a mile away from where Denita had been killed, and he saw a black Dodge Shadow parked on the side of the road. When he drove up behind it, he saw it was empty, so he called the police station and asked them to run the license plates. And when they called him back, they told him that the plates did not belong to a black Dodge Shadow. They belonged to a blue Pontiac Grand Am, and that the Grand Am was registered to a 34-year-old man named Joseph Wilkerson. Sergeant Huber was confused and thought maybe he had given them the wrong plates, but then he noticed, parked a little ways down the road ahead of the Dodge Shadow, was a blue Pontiac Grand Am. And so on a hunch, Huber drove forward and he took down the Grand Am's license plates and he called back into the police station and he asked them to run those. And they would come back and they would say, well, it turns out the plates on the Grand Am are the plates that should be on Kathy Henderson's Dodge Shadow. Meaning, clearly, in an effort to cover their trail, the suspects had switched the license plates between these two cars. And so, naturally, Sergeant Huber picked up his radio and he asked if Joseph Wilkerson had reported his car as stolen. And after a few moments, the radio crackled back from headquarters that no, Joseph Wilkerson had not reported this car stolen. So Huber immediately became very suspicious of this Joseph Wilkerson person and told headquarters they should really send someone over to Joseph's property to talk to him, since most likely he was either one of the shooters or was involved in some way with all of these shootings. Huber said he would stay put on this road and he would stake out these two vehicles and wait to see if anyone came back to claim them. Detective Burke and his team were the ones dispatched to go check out the Wilkerson property. It was a small single-floor white house that was located only about 2.5 miles from where Denita had been killed. Burke opened the front gate that surrounded the property and he walked along the pathway up onto the front porch and he knocked on the front door, but there was no answer. Burke called out that, hey, it's police, you gotta open up, but there was silence in the house. Burke left the porch and walked around to the back of the house and knocked on the back door, but still no one came to the door. However, as Burke and his team stood around the back of the house, they all started to smell something awful. It was this putrid smell that was definitely coming from inside the house. They didn't know what the smell was, but given the circumstances and frankly the urgency to figure out who is behind all these shootings, they decided this smell constituted potential foul play, and so they kicked in the back door and they made entry into the house. Immediately, the smell picked up tenfold. It smelled absolutely horrible inside this house. And just from a quick glance around the inside, it was very obvious this house had been ransacked. Somebody had robbed this house. All the drawers and cabinets had been opened. There was trash and clothing and random pieces of electronics all over the ground. And so the police, they have their guns out. They're scanning around the room and they're yelling out, "Police, if you're here, show yourself. We're coming in." But no one showed themselves. It was all silent in the house. And so the police began carefully stepping through the house, and they eventually turned right and began walking down this one central hallway that seemed to lead to kind of a back room that looked like maybe a bedroom at the end of the hall. And as they're walking down this hallway, the smell is getting stronger and stronger. And then finally they get to the end of this hallway and they look into this room and they can see what is causing the smell. There on the bed in this room was 34-year-old Joseph Wilkerson. His wrists and his ankles had been tied to the 4 posters of the bed with electrical wire, kind of putting him in a spread eagle position on his back. He had no clothes on, but he had a pillow over his chest and his head, and on the outside, on the top of the pillow, were 2 obvious scorch marks. Someone had clearly pressed a gun into that pillow and then fired 2 shots through it into Joseph's chest and his head, killing him. And from the look of his body and the smell, Wilkerson had likely been dead for at least several days. Also on the ground was another aluminum shell casing, meaning almost certainly this murder was connected to all the others. But the police still had no clue who their attackers were. Who were these mysterious 2 young men? Who was this young girl who jumped out of that car? Was that Laura Taylor? Was that the ex-girlfriend? Was she kidnapped? They didn't know. None of it made any sense. Who were the victims? They don't know each other. Why are they being chosen? What is the connection? And so because the police were kind of at a dead end and they really didn't know where to take this case, they set up a tip line that night for people in Dayton and outside of Dayton to call in with any information about any of these shooting victims. And over the first couple of hours that this tip line was established, the callers that were calling in were providing nothing of value. But late that night on the 26th, a call came through from an 18-year-old named Nicholas Woodson. And based on the tone of his voice, it was obvious he was genuinely scared for his life. He told police that he thought he was going to be the next Dayton murder victim. When police asked him why, he said, "Because I know who the killers are. There's 4 of them, and I think they're planning to kill me next to keep me from talking to you." While the police spoke with Nicholas, Sergeant Huber was still hiding out in his patrol car, watching the Dodge Shadow and the Pontiac Grand Am from a distance. He was kind of hidden behind some trees. And at some point, he saw movement in an apartment building situated just opposite where these 2 vehicles were parked. 3 young people walked out of the building. They walked down the front steps out onto the road, and as they crossed over the road towards the two vehicles, they were illuminated by the street light, and Huber could clearly see there were two young men and a small young woman. One of the men climbed into the driver's seat of the Dodge Shadow, while the other two climbed into the passenger and back seat of the Shadow. As the driver turned the Shadow on and pulled away from the curb, Huber radioed into headquarters that the vehicle was on the move and he needed backup right away, and then he too pulled away from the curb and began following them. After just 2 blocks, the Shadow stopped, and at that moment, Sergeant Huber sped up behind them with his lights on, and immediately the passenger door of the Shadow flew open and one of the 2 men took off running, but the other man and the woman stayed in the vehicle. Huber's backup had not arrived yet, so he couldn't worry about the runner. Instead, he stepped out of his car and stood behind his open car door to kind of use it as a shield, and he aimed his pistol at the driver and he yelled for them not to move. Inside the Dodge, the interior light was now on, and it showed the man was still sitting in the driver's seat, not really doing anything, and the young woman who was in the car, who was in the back seat, she was becoming hysterical, and she was screaming at the driver to shoot him now, shoot him now! But the driver didn't do anything. And then moments later, backup arrived and they were able to pull the man and the woman out of the Dodge without a fight, and they arrested them both. They were 19-year-old Marvalis Keene, and the young woman was none other than 16-year-old Laura Taylor, the ex-girlfriend of Richmond Maddox, whose family had reported her missing. The police searched the nearby buildings for the man who had run, and they quickly found him. He had gone back inside the apartment building that Sergeant Huber had originally seen the trio come out of before they got into the Dodge Shadow. The runner was 17-year-old DeMarcus Smith, and with him in the building he was attempting to hide inside of was 20-year-old Heather Matthews, and she was actively trying to hide DeMarcus. And so both of them were arrested as well. When all 4 of them were brought back to the station, the police noticed that Marvalis was wearing Denita's flannel jacket and DeMarcus was wearing Denita's sneakers. Additionally, while these 4 were being processed at the police station, a call came in from a team of police investigators who were searching the Dodge Shadow, and they would say that they recovered 2 guns, a .32 caliber Derringer pistol and a .25 caliber pistol that contained the same distinctive aluminum ammunition that was used in almost all of the murders. The police had just caught their killers, and they would soon find out they had done a lot more damage than the public was aware of. The police would interrogate all 4 of them that night, starting with Laura Taylor, who they thought would be the easiest to get information from because she was 16, so she was the youngest, and she was considered to be very kind and thoughtful. But Laura would remain silent for the entire long interrogation, and when she was asked at some point if she wanted to take a break to go use the restroom, she just stood up and urinated directly onto the floor and then sat back down again in silence. But Laura was the only one who acted tough. The other 3 talked, and before long, the police heard the whole awful story of what they had done. It all started back on the night of December 24th, Christmas Eve. Laura, Heather, and Marvalis were sitting around together talking about how they needed money. And at some point, Laura suggested they rob a guy she knew, Joseph Wilkerson. She said he probably had lots of nice things in his house, and I know he has a car, so we can take all of that. The other 2 liked the idea, and so Laura called Joseph and asked him if he wanted to be a part of an orgy with them, and Joseph said yes. So the trio walked over to Joseph's house, he let them in, and then the 2 girls and Joseph walked back into that back bedroom while Marvalis sat on the couch in the living room. In the bedroom, Joseph laid on the bed and he took his clothes off, and Heather and Laura pretended to start taking their clothes off when suddenly Marvalis, as planned, came bursting into the room, and then he ordered Heather and Laura to tie Joseph's hands and ankles to the 4 posters of the bed. Joseph immediately begins to beg for his life and tells them they can take anything they want in the house. Anything in this house, it's yours, just please don't shoot me. Marvalis instructed the girls to go search his house for valuables. And so while Marvalis is standing there with the gun aimed at Joseph, Joseph, perhaps in an attempt to kind of bargain his way out of this, says to Marvalis, hey, I have a really amazing gun, a .32 caliber Derringer that I have hidden in the garage. If you want it, I can tell you where it is. And so Marvalis was totally interested, and he said, yeah, tell me where it is. And so Joseph explained where to go in the garage, and so Marvalis left the room, he went into the garage, and he would eventually find this little gun, this .32 caliber gun. And then when Marvalis walked back into the bedroom with Joseph, he promptly walked over to Joseph, grabbed a pillow, he put it over Joseph's chest. Joseph is just looking up at him, wondering what he's doing. And then Marvalis took this new gun, this .32 caliber Derringer, and he pushed it into the pillow, so it was aiming straight down at Joseph's body. Joseph pleaded with him not to shoot him, but Marvalis pulled the trigger and he fired a shot through the pillow into Joseph's chest. Joseph began screaming, and then he made this guttural sound and his whole body began to shake. And so the other two girls, they heard the sound of the shot, so they came running back into the bedroom. And when they saw what was happening, they just stood there. And then Laura looked over at Marvalis and said, "Hey, can I shoot him too?" And Marvalis says, "Sure." And he hands her the .32 caliber Derringer, the one they had taken from the garage. And Laura takes the gun. She walks over to the still shaking Wilkerson. She repositions the pillow on his face. She pushes the Derringer into the pillow, aiming right at Joseph's face. And then she pulls the trigger, but it doesn't fire. And so frustrated, she turns away from Wilkerson, who's still making all sorts of noise. He's still shaking. And she walks over to Marvalis and says, "Let me use your gun." And so Marvalis pulls out a .25 caliber gun. It was his gun. It was the gun that used aluminum shell casing rounds. And he hands it to Laura. And so Laura hands him the Derringer. She takes the .25 caliber. And then she walks right next to Joseph again. She grabs the pillow and makes sure it's flush to his face. She puts the .25 caliber gun up against the pillow, aiming it right at Joseph's face, and then she pulls the trigger. This time the gun would fire, and as soon as it did, Joseph's body stopped shaking and he went limp. As the trio stood there staring at Joseph Wilkerson's lifeless body, they all realized something. Killing was actually quite fun. The trio left the bedroom and began eating Wilkerson's food and watching his TV and looking for things to steal, all the while happily talking about how amazing the killing experience had just been. Eventually, though, their killing high had worn off, and they realized that Wilkerson did not have any cash in the house, and really, he didn't have nice stuff in his house, so they couldn't really even sell very much of it for very much money. And so they decided they needed to go rob somebody else to get the money they needed. But first, they recruited another friend of theirs, DeMarcus Smith, to come over and join them. When DeMarcus arrived, he, along with Laura and Marvalis, left Wilkerson's house, leaving Heather behind to watch over the place. The trio walked away from the house towards town, keeping an eye out for anyone who was out alone and could potentially be an easy target to mug. And eventually, around 10 p.m., they spotted a young woman they didn't know standing near a payphone. It was Denita, and she was fishing coins out of her pocket to put into the phone. By the time Denita had finished dialing the number of her mother's house, she heard the sound of Marvalis and DeMarcus come running up behind her, and when she turned around, she saw they had guns pointing at her, so she dropped the phone. Then the two men demanded she give them her shoes, which she instantly did, but then, simply because he thought it would be fun, Marvalis still just started shooting her. So he shot Denita 4 times, and then DeMarcus, who had not been a part of the Wilkerson killing, just immediately joined in, and he shot her a 5th time. After she was laying on the ground, dead or dying, the two men yanked her plaid jacket and her backpack off, and then they ran back to Laura on the other side of the road, and the trio retreated back to the Wilkerson house. When Denita's sister, Rhonda, picked up that phone call around 10 p.m. and was met with silence, that really had been her sister, Denita, calling, but Denita had died literally seconds before the line had connected. Even though, once again, their robbery target did not yield them very much in terms of monetary value, The friends felt like this second murder was still a really good thing. It was a turning point for them. They felt invincible. Killing was the best high that any of them had ever experienced. So in some ways, it didn't matter that they weren't making any money out of these robberies. It was the killing part they liked. To celebrate their murders, the four friends threw a party that night at Wilkerson's house. So Wilkerson's dead body is just literally decomposing in the bedroom. They just shut the door during this party. One of the people who showed up to this party was Jeffrey Wright, one of Heather's former boyfriends. And at some point in the night, Heather and Jeffrey got into this huge argument, and Jeffrey grabbed Heather by the hair and started dragging her into a back room. And so, drawn by the commotion of this, MrBallen burst into the room after them and chased Jeffrey, who leapt out of a window. MrBallen jumped out of the window after him and then began shooting at him, hitting Jeffrey 4 times in the legs as he ran away. Miraculously, Jeffrey would make it to a hospital and he would survive, though he would not go to police and tell them what happened. Seeing Heather's ex-boyfriend get shot excited Laura, and she decided she wanted to shoot her ex-boyfriend too. So the next day, on Christmas, Laura called up Richmond Maddox and asked him if he wanted to have sex with her at a nearby motel. When he said yes, she told him he would have to pay for the motel, so bring cash. Richmond agreed, and when he arrived at the designated meeting place that day, Laura climbed into the front passenger seat next to him, knowing full well she was going to kill him and steal the money out of his wallet first chance she got. But after they took off, Richmond looked in his rearview mirror and he saw MrBallen and DeMarcus following them in a car. Sensing this was a setup, Richmond hit the gas, and without any hesitation, Laura pulled out the .32 caliber Derringer pistol they had stolen from Wilkerson. She placed it against Richmond's right temple and she fired. Then she threw herself out of the moving car right before it crashed into the tree. MrBallen and DeMarcus would swing by and pick her up a little ways down the road, and then the trio would head back to their base of operations, the Wilkerson house. At this point, the foursome had killed 3 people and nearly killed a 4th. But while they were very pleased with this, they still hadn't managed to take anything of real value from any of their victims, and realistically, even though the killing was fun, they did need cash. They had no money. So the next morning, on December 26th, Laura, MrBallen, DeMarcus, and Heather decided they would rob a convenience store. So they pulled up in front of Sarah Abraham's store, and while Heather, DeMarcus, and MrBallen waited outside in the car, Laura went in to scope the place out. After going inside and counting how many people were in there, although she counted wrong, she walked up to the counter to buy gum, but she was a nickel short. However, 71-year-old Jimmy Thompson gave her the nickel she needed, and so she bought the gum, she smiled, and she made her way out. When she walked back outside, she hopped into the car, and she told DeMarcus and MrBallen that it was just 2 people inside, the cashier and the man who had given her a nickel. She had not seen Jones Pettis, who was at the end of one of the aisles. So DeMarcus and MrBallen go inside the shop, and they hold Sarah and Jimmy at gunpoint, and after getting all the cash out of the cash register, which was only $40, the urge to kill became too much for MrBallen to control. And so he raised his gun, he aimed it at Sarah, and he shot her in the face. DeMarcus would attempt to shoot Jimmy, but he would miss. And then the pair, on their way out, would notice Jones at the end of the aisle. And even though he posed absolutely no threat to them, they shot at him anyways. After Heather drove them away from the convenience store, they stopped at a gas station for reasons we don't really know, at which point DeMarcus and MrBallen, they see this woman, Kathy Henderson, who's just completely minding her own business. She's putting air in her Dodge Shadow's tires, and they decide they're going to kill her too. So they hop out of the car, they walk over to her, and MrBallen literally says to her, "You're going to die today," and then he raises his gun and he begins shooting at her, as does DeMarcus. But amazingly, they miss her, and so she gets away. She does not get shot. And then they just steal her car. Even though by now the foursome had left behind an astounding amount of evidence that 100% was going to get them caught eventually. Despite that, their only fear at this time was that 2 of their friends, 18-year-old Marvin Washington and 16-year-old Wendy Cottrill, might snitch and turn them in. Marvin and Wendy had been present at that big party at the Wilkerson's house and had overheard the foursome talking about the murders, and the foursome knew they had overheard. But strangely, Wendy and Marvin were not the only people at that party who had overheard them. 18-year-old Nicholas Woodson was also at this party, and he overheard, and they knew he overheard. But for some reason, the foursome had identified Marvin and Wendy as the most likely to snitch. And so Marvalis confronted the pair about this, and he told them they would have to come along for the next murder to prove their loyalty and trustworthiness. And Wendy and Marvin agreed. And so that night on December 26th, Marvalis and DeMarcus drove Marvin and Wendy out to the edge of town to this gravel pit. And when they got there and parked the car, Wendy and Marvin realized they were the next murder victims. They pleaded with Marvalis to let them go, that they wouldn't say anything, they promised, but he wasn't having it. Marvin eventually got out of the car and DeMarcus followed, and DeMarcus told Marvin to get on his knees, which he did, and then DeMarcus shot him in the back of the head, execution style. And so Wendy has seen this happen, so she knows she's next, and she begins screaming and begging for her life, and she grabs onto the inside of the car so as not to get pulled out. But DeMarcus comes back over to the car, he grabs her and starts pulling on her, and then Marvalis as well comes around and he grabs onto her too. And between the two of them, they're able to pull Wendy out of the car, at which point Marvalis told her to open her mouth. And eventually she would, and Marvalis put the pistol, the .25 caliber pistol, into her mouth, and he told her to bite the barrel. And then when she was biting the barrel, he pulled the trigger. The killers left the bodies where they fell and just hopped back in their car and headed back into town. Nicholas Woodson likely knew that Marvin and Wendy had just been killed for snitching. And so he's thinking to himself, I overheard them talking about the murders. What's stopping Marvalis and DeMarcus from killing me next? I know about the murders, and they know that. And so that was the point at which Nicholas would call the tip line and he would say, I know who the killers are. It's these four people. And literally, practically at the exact same time that Nicholas was giving this tip, Sergeant Huber had spotted Marvalis and DeMarcus and Laura getting into the Dodge Shadow, which would lead to their arrest as well as Heather Matthews' arrest. After going to trial a year later, Laura Taylor, Heather Matthews, and DeMarcus Smith would all receive life sentences. As for Marvalis Keene, who was effectively the ringleader of the foursome, he would be sentenced to death. His execution was carried out on July 21st, 2009. He died by lethal injection. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please ask to borrow the 5-star review button's phone to make a quick call, but instead log on to their Facebook and change their relationship status from married to it's complicated. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please send me a direct message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the spring of 1995, something strange was spotted on the floor of a Tokyo subway car. At first, no one really paid much attention to it other than to just be annoyed someone had littered. But eventually, this object would change. And as it did, people around it began to change too. And before long, it was absolute pandemonium inside of the subway. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please take a picture of the 5-star review button's lawn ornaments and then post that picture along with their street address on Craigslist with the caption "free." Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. It was Monday, March 20th, 1995, and Japan's capital city of Tokyo was waking up to a truly beautiful early spring day. By the end of the month, the city's famous cherry blossom trees would be in bloom, attracting thousands of visitors and residents to the cherry blossom festivals that would pop up in half a dozen places throughout what is the largest urban center in the world. But on that particular morning, many of those who worked in Tokyo, like 26-year-old airline employee Kyoka Izumi, were not happy when they heard their alarms going off. The day before had been Sunday, so a day off, and the next day, Tuesday, was also a day off because it was the national holiday celebrating the spring equinox. But that day, Monday, was just a regular work day. And so when Kyoka rolled out of her bed at 6:15 a.m., she felt super annoyed that her employer hadn't just given them the day off to make it a long weekend. To make matters worse, as soon as Kyoka actually got out of bed, she immediately felt sick. Nothing major, but she just felt groggy and a little out of it, and she briefly thought about calling out of work, and considering how uninspired she already felt about working that day, the option sounded like a pretty good one, but ultimately, she decided to suck it up and head in with the rest of her coworkers. After all, Kyoka did like her job. She found working for the airline industry was far more exciting than her previous job was, which had been working for one of Japan's major train companies, Japan Railway. And she figured getting up and moving around might actually make her feel better. So instead of going back to sleep, Kyoka headed for the shower, then she got dressed and downed her usual quick cup of coffee. Then she headed out the door and began speedwalking to the closest subway station. Once she got there, she would catch the first of 3 trains that would take her from her home in northwest Tokyo to her office in the southeastern part of Japan's capital. As Kyoka walked, the last of the light purple plum blossoms that always bloomed at the end of February reminded her again of tomorrow's spring holiday. Her spirits lifting, she glanced at the time, and despite getting a slower than usual start that morning, she'd left the house at about 7:50 a.m., she still was on track to get to her office right before the day began at 8:30. A few minutes later, Kyoka got to the entrance of the local train station. She was lucky because the timing of her daily commute meant that she always missed the absolute height of Tokyo's morning rush hour, where the subways would get so crowded with people, subway attendants in uniforms and caps literally pushed people and their bags into the train cars just so the doors could close. But even at its most crowded, and the Tokyo subway carried more than twice as many riders as the New York City subway, Tokyo actually has one of the safest, most efficient subway systems in the world. Walk into a Tokyo subway at any hour of the day, and you will not see people sleeping on benches or warming up on top of heating grates. You won't see trash, you won't see graffiti. It will be pristine. The same subway attendants who push people onto the trains also spend a large amount of their time patrolling the subway to pick up trash and make sure everything is always spotless. Kyoka turned off the sidewalk and headed down the stairs into the less than crowded subway station below. She swiped her train pass and then stepped through the turnstile out onto the train platform. A few minutes later, the first train she would take arrived, and she stepped on board and she grabbed a seat near the doors. The doors shut a few moments later, and off the train went, rumbling into the dark tunnel ahead. 5 stops later, Kyoka stepped off of that train and walked across to the other side of the station platform, where she stood idly waiting to catch the next train. A few minutes later, that train would arrive. It was train A725K, and it pulled into the station right in front of her. This train would take her all the way to Government Center, which is right in the center of Tokyo, and is one of the busiest train stations in all of Japan. When the doors of train A725K opened, Kyoka stepped aboard and once again felt lucky she was missing rush hour because the train, it was crowded, but not so crowded that pushers would be required to get everyone on board. Most of the seats were taken, but Kyoka could see a clearing towards the front of the car where she'd be able to stand. And so as she began walking in that direction, she nodded to a few familiar faces but didn't have any conversations with anyone. Tokyo subway etiquette included never littering, not making any commotion, and not talking too loudly, or really at all. And this morning, that suited Kyoka just fine. She really did not feel like talking anyway. When she reached the clearing in the front of the car, she grabbed onto a handrail above her head, and she watched as the doors closed, and then she felt the train begin to lurch forward. When Kyoka left that morning, she had hoped her morning commute would wake her up and make her feel better, but as she stood there on this second train, A725K, she couldn't help but notice that she actually was starting to feel worse. As this train slowly rumbled on in the darkness, Kyoka closed her eyes and took a deep breath in to try to reduce the nausea that was starting to come on. But as her lungs filled, she suddenly felt this excruciating pain in her chest. It was so blindingly painful and so sudden that she instinctively let go of the handrail and grabbed at her chest with both of her hands, almost causing her to fall over, given the fact that the train was moving. She breathed out forcibly and then gagged as if the air she had just inhaled was the source of the pain, but even with her lungs now empty, her chest still ached. But just as quickly as the pain had started, it stopped. And when it did, she fumbled again for the handrail above her head, and once she had a firm grasp on it and she was steady on her feet, she told herself that, that pain had probably just been connected to stress, as her grandfather had passed away recently, and she was very upset about that, and so she was thinking, okay, that could be why. Or maybe it was connected to her just not feeling very good that morning to begin with. Maybe this is just her being sick. But after she was able to kind of talk herself down and convince herself that this was not a big deal, something else registered to her, which was she had just grabbed at her chest and started gagging, and very obviously it just kind of made this scene. People are going to be staring at her and wondering now if she's okay. And so Kyoka starts to feel super embarrassed as she's still kind of looking down, and she's imagining that when she looks up, there's going to be all these commuters staring at her, waiting to see, is she okay or not? And so Kyoka, eventually, she does look up, and she's anticipating kind of like waving to people and kind of signaling that she was okay now. But when she looked up, she was kind of surprised at what she saw, because when she looked around into the train car, no one was looking at her. And the reason was everyone in the train, everyone was coughing. No one was paying attention to her. All they were doing was trying to cover their mouths as they all coughed. So everyone's got their jackets over their faces, and they have their elbows up over their mouths. And Kyoka's just kind of looking around, wondering what the heck is going on. And then she felt her own throat start to tighten, and she started to cough. And as Kyoka tried to shield her own mouth, she noticed the people around her had gone from a somewhat mild cough to a violent one. Some people were coughing so aggressively they could not catch their breath, and you could see panic on their faces as they don't know what to do. They're not able to breathe. But despite this totally insane coughing phenomenon that was taking place on board this train car, the train just rumbled on and continued making all of its scheduled stops. And as new commuters clambered on board, they too began to cough. By the time the train pulled into Government Center, Kyoka's stop, virtually everyone was now violently coughing and keeled over. People had given up trying to shield their mouths at this point. It was just too out of control. And by now, basically everyone had decided they were just going to get off the train, whether Government Center was their stop or not. And so there was a throng of people that were kind of pressed up against the doors, waiting for the doors to open. And so when the train finally did come to a full stop and the doors opened up, a wave of coughing commuters rushed out onto the station platform, the sound of their hacking and gagging filling the air. And so Kyoka, she was towards the back of this group of people leaving the train. And as she was leaving, right as she's about to go out of the train doors, she glances down the length of the train car she is in, and she sees some of the passengers are pointing at something on the ground while yelling for subway attendants to come have a look. But Kyoka, from where she was standing, she couldn't see what they were pointing at, and because she wanted fresh air so badly, she was not about to stay on the train to figure out what it is. And so Kyoka, she gets off of the train, and as soon as she does, even though she is still coughing, as is everybody else around her, her mind is entirely focused on hustling over to the stairs that will bring her downstairs to the final train platform where she will catch the final third train that will bring her on her way to work. Because at this point, even though she has no idea why everybody is coughing, Kyoka is only viewing this coughing fit as a nuisance, not as an emergency. But as Kyoka moved towards these stairs, she suddenly felt extremely nauseous, and she rushed into a nearby women's bathroom in case she needed to throw up. Once she was inside, she resisted the urge to vomit, and then she splashed some water on her face, and then after kind of composing herself, she headed back out onto the station platform, and still her mind is focused on just getting to work. And so she begins walking over to the stairs again. But she'd only gone maybe a few steps before an alarm sounded inside of the subway, and then a voice came over the subway intercom telling everyone to evacuate. Having worked for Japan Railways previously, Kyoka had been educated about this particular alarm that she was hearing. She was told it was never used for anything other than true emergencies, so she knew whatever was going on had to be bad. Right around the time that Kyoka was getting ready to leave for her daily commute to work, 48-year-old Ikuyo Hayashi was also getting ready for work. Hayashi was part of Japan's highly educated and financially successful super elite. He was a gifted and well-respected surgeon who was known for being extremely devoted to his patients. On that particular Monday, like Kyoka, Dr. Hayashi had gotten up early. But shortly after starting his typical morning routine, he noticed he was sweating a little bit and his heart rate was elevated. For a second, he felt concerned, but he chalked it up to stress and kept getting ready. Just before 7:30 a.m., he headed to the front door. Before stepping into the cold morning air, he patted his coat pockets to make sure he had everything. Then, despite the clear forecast for the rest of the day, he grabbed an umbrella leaning up against the front door, and then he stepped outside and made his way to the curb where a car was waiting for him. Dr. Hayashi climbed into the back seat, and then after exchanging hellos with the driver, a 31-year-old named Tomomitsu Nimi, the two men headed for the station, where Dr. Hayashi would catch train A725K. But along the way, they made one stop at a local convenience store. Dr. Hayashi and Nimi got out of the car and went inside. Hayashi put a few odds and ends that he needed on the counter, and Nimi put a couple of newspapers on the counter as well. After Dr. Hayashi had paid for it all, the two men left the store together, they got back into the car, and by 7:48 a.m., Dr. Hayashi was stepping aboard the same compartment of train A725K as Kyoka. After dropping off the doctor and wishing him luck, Nimi had pulled away from the station entrance and headed straight for the train station located just 3 stops further down the line. As soon as he stepped on board train A725K, Dr. Hayashi reached up to adjust the gauze mask he was wearing over his nose and mouth. The mask was a fixture on the Tokyo subway, especially in the cold and flu season when passengers wore them to prevent the spread of germs in the crowded subway compartments. He moved over to an empty seat, and before sitting down, he patted his coat pockets again to make sure he had all of his things. And then as he sat down, he saw sitting across from him was a woman and what appeared to be her young daughter sitting next to her. The woman was looking down, avoiding eye contact, but the young girl was looking up with a smile on her face. She was just too young to realize staring was rude. The doctor smiled back at her, but then quickly looked away. A few seconds later, the doors of the train closed, and the car began rumbling down the tracks. 3 stops later, Dr. Hayashi stood up, but before he got off, he paused for a moment in front of his seat. As he stood there, he noticed the girl was staring at him again. He looked at her, but only for a second. Then, after patting his coat pockets for a 3rd time, he quickly strode out of the train car and onto the station platform. He moved quickly to a nearby trash can and pulled the mask off of his face and disposed of it. Then, forcing himself not to hurry, Dr. Hayashi climbed the steps to the street where Nimi, his driver, was waiting for him by the curb. Immediately after the doctor got off the train, the little girl who had been sitting in front of him noticed a pile of newspapers underneath the seat where the doctor had just been sitting. Even as a youngster, she knew littering was strictly forbidden, and she wondered if the doctor or someone else had left it there. As she stared at this newspaper, she noticed a wet spot starting to form in the center of it, like the paper was sitting on top of a liquid and it was starting to seep through. As she stared, her eyes began to water and then she began to cough. Her mother turned to see if her daughter was okay, but before she could offer the child any help or comfort, she too began to cough. And then, just a few feet away from them at the front of the car, Kyoka felt that sharp shooting pain in her chest and nearly fell over, and then she too started to cough. But despite all of the coughing, the train kept rumbling on, headed for Japan's government center, where 3 major subway lines all converged. And as commuters shuffled on and off of train A725K, they pushed the now soaking wet newspaper aside with the toes of their shoes. They also stepped in what looked like an oily residue around the wet newspapers, tracking it up and down the compartment and out onto the train platforms. When the train finally reached the government center and Kyoka got off along with most of the others, some of the passengers stayed on board to point out the wet newspapers to subway attendants on the platform, hoping they could come clean them up. After getting off of the train, Kyoka felt nauseous and rushed to the bathroom. Right before she walked into the women's room, she passed by 24-year-old subway attendant Masura Yuasa, who had just finished a 24-hour shift and was getting ready to go home. The pair didn't know each other and probably didn't even see each other when they passed, but before the day was over, they would be forever bound by tragedy. Masura really liked his job with the Tokyo Metro, and despite looking like he was still in high school, he actually had worked as a subway attendant for 7 years. As he passed by Kyoka, he heard people coughing on the platform, but it wasn't something that really registered to him. He was only thinking about going home and going to bed because he was exhausted from his overnight shift. As he moved along the platform, he saw his chief suddenly coming out of an office with a mop in his hand. And so, intrigued, Masura asked him, what's up with the mop? And his chief would tell him that there had been some sort of liquid spill on one of the trains, and whatever it was had apparently been tracked all over the train, and now it was out all over the station platform, and so he needed to go and clean it up. Masura didn't actually need to help him. His shift was over, but he told his chief that he'd go along and he'd help out. So Masura and his chief walked together down the platform, and as they walked, they both started to notice that just about every commuter they passed was coughing. But neither Masura nor his chief addressed it, they just kept on walking. Eventually, they saw 3 of their fellow subway attendants straight ahead, standing in the middle of the platform. 2 of the men were holding in their hands the wet newspapers that had been inside train A725K, and a third man who was next to them was opening up a trash bag. And as the 2 men who were holding the newspaper were waiting for this bag to be opened, oily liquid seemed to be pouring off of the newspaper's edges onto the ground. And in fact, there was a long, oily trail on the ground from wherever these papers had been carried from all the way to that platform. And so as soon as Masura and the chief walked up in front of these 3, the chief noticed the huge oily puddle right underneath them, and he saw the trail, and so he got to work trying to mop up this oil all over the ground. And Masura, he didn't really have a job to do. He didn't have a mop, and he didn't have a bag or anything, so he just stood there watching. And as he stood there, it really started to sink in that virtually everyone on the platform now was violently coughing. And some people were even leaned up against the wall vomiting. And so Masura was so confused by what he was seeing, but before he could even ask his coworkers what was going on, his throat started to tighten up. And then right as Masura began coughing, he saw one of his coworkers collapse. It was the older man named Mr. Takahashi. He was the one who had had the plastic bag, which was now full of the wet newspapers. And right as Mr. Takahashi fell, to Masura, it felt like all hell had suddenly broken loose. He and the others who were around Mr. Takahashi rushed over to him to see if they could help him, and right as they're standing over him, loosening his tie and asking him if he is okay, the alarm goes off and the call over the intercom to evacuate comes out. Masura was just in shock, and for a second he just stood there frozen. But then he shook himself out of it and he ran for a phone on the wall that the subway staff would use. And he pushed the button that would call to the office that was upstairs, and when somebody picked up on the other line, Masura had to yell because of the alarm and all the coughing people and people screaming and panicking all around him. And so Masura was able to yell out into the phone that someone needed to bring a stretcher down to the platform he was on for Mr. Takahashi, who has collapsed, and someone needs to call an ambulance for Mr. Takahashi. And so after Masura communicates this over the phone, he hangs up and he runs back over to the crowd of his coworkers and Mr. Takahashi. And then just a minute later, a subway attendant comes charging down the stairs. He's got a stretcher in hand, and he, along with Masura and the other coworkers, they put Mr. Takahashi on this stretcher and they lift him up and they begin carefully moving him through this very panicked throng of commuters trying to evacuate that are coughing and vomiting. And so as they're moving, Masura, who's holding onto the stretcher, he turns back and he yells at the man who had come down with the stretcher. He says to him, "Hey, you called the ambulance. Where are they going to meet us?" Because upstairs, there were several exits out of Government Center. And so unless the ambulance knew where to pick them up, it would be nearly impossible to sync up with them. And so Masura's looking back at this coworker of his, waiting for an answer, but this coworker is staring at Masura with his eyes wide, totally glazed over. And then suddenly this guy just collapses to the ground. He lets go of the stretcher and falls to the ground and starts convulsing and shaking. And so Masura and the others put Mr. Takahashi down to deal with this new casualty. And as they did, Masura's chief, as well as the other two men who had been holding the newspapers, they begin to uncontrollably vomit. And so suddenly Masura is the only one who is not violently ill or in some way hurt. And so even though he had no idea what was going on and it's absolute chaos all around him, he did know he had to act right now. And so he yelled at this group he was with, who probably didn't even hear him, that he was going to go upstairs, he was going to find this ambulance and figure out what exit they needed to bring Mr. Takahashi to. And then he turned and began trying to run up the stairs as fast as he could, even though he was totally surrounded by panicked commuters trying to get out as well. But eventually he got to the top of the stairs, at which point he ran through the crowd toward the nearest doors that would bring him outside. And as soon as he pushed the doors open, he couldn't believe what he saw. There were people outside on the ground everywhere. People were coughing and vomiting, and you could hear sirens, ambulance sirens everywhere. But there was no ambulance outside waiting for Mr. Takahashi. And so he's thinking to himself, how is this ambulance not here? Where are these other ambulances going? What is going on? And so Masura couldn't help but think something really bad was happening across his city. And so he stood there for a minute wondering what he should do, and then he just decided, I have to go back down and just get Mr. Takahashi up here. We'll find the ambulance, but I gotta get him up here. And so even though he was starting to feel very sick, very nauseous, he turns and just charges back into the station. Below ground, Kyoka was coming to the same realization that something very bad must be happening to them. When she left the bathroom and began running up the stairs to the street after the alarm went off, she had looked behind her at some point, and through the sea of people, she could clearly see bodies lying on the ground, on the platform, and on the stairs. And as she ran, people to her left and to her right were crumpling to the ground, vomiting and convulsing. Finally, she managed to get upstairs and she ran toward the same exit doors that Masura had just gone through moments before her. And when she looked outside, her mind froze. The streets looked like a battlefield. People were violently convulsing on the sidewalk. There were people with spoons in their mouths, which she would later learn was to keep them from swallowing their tongues. She also saw men in business suits lying in flower beds, staring straight up into the sky without blinking. One elderly man was foaming at the mouth. And so as she stood there shocked, Masura, along with the other very sick subway attendants, they had rallied their strength and lifted Mr. Takahashi up on his stretcher, and they had brought him upstairs, and so they came barging out the doors right next to her, and then they placed Mr. Takahashi down kind of right in front of Kyoka. And Kyoka, she doesn't know who these people are, but she found herself just staring at them, and she watched as Masura ran up right next to Mr. Takahashi, and he was holding his hand, and he's kind of crying and trying to talk to Mr. Takahashi, and Masura is yelling out for someone to help him find an ambulance. And so Kyoka, she's kind of in shock and she's just staring at everything going on, not sure what to do. But then she kind of snaps out of it and she hears Masura and she decides, okay, I'm going to help him find an ambulance. And so she yells to Masura that she's going to go find his ambulance. And so she runs all the way down to the street, which was not far from the exit of the subway station. And when she was in the road, she heard the sirens everywhere. They were all over Tokyo, but there were none near them. But Kyoka noticed there was this news van that had just pulled up and all these news people had hopped out and they had their cameras up and they're filming the exits of the subway station. And Kyoka just suddenly felt furious and she screamed at them to stop filming, help us. And so the news crew, they kind of sensed the gravity of the situation, even though they really had no idea what was going on. And they said to Kyoka, what can we do? And she said, stay right there. You're going to drive someone to the hospital. And then Kyoka ran back to Masura and she got him and his coworkers to lift up Mr. Takahashi. And they went down to the news van and they loaded Mr. Takahashi into the back of the news van. And Kyoka would give Masura her handkerchief. And she says, look, hang this out the window and wave it the whole time. They're going to drive you to the hospital. People will see you waving that and they will know it's an emergency. And so Masura thanked her and he and all of his coworkers hopped in the van with the news crew and they headed off. Mr. Takahashi would unfortunately die before they reached the hospital. By now, it was obvious to basically everyone in Tokyo that something horrible had happened inside of the subway, but nobody knew what it was. However, when the truth was finally uncovered, people had a very hard time believing it. Earlier that morning, just before Dr. Hayashi got off of train A725K, he stood up in front of his seat and momentarily paused. As he stood there, he acted like he was patting his coat down one more time to make sure he had all of his belongings, but he wasn't really doing that. He was using that innocent-seeming gesture to shake loose a folded-up newspaper that was inside of his jacket. It was the same newspaper that his driver had purchased at the convenience store with him that morning. And once it was loose, it fell from the inside of his jacket down onto the ground right next to Dr. Hayashi's right foot. And Dr. Hayashi, he acted like he didn't know he had just done that. He kind of ignored the newspaper on the ground. The only person on the train who seemed to be paying any attention to him was the little girl who was sitting in front of him. As he stood, Dr. Hayashi looked at her, but only for a moment before he looked away. Then he carefully, but forcefully, pushed the sharpened tip of his umbrella straight down into the newspaper that he had just dropped. He did this several times without looking down before finally hustling off the train. Wrapped up inside of the newspaper he dropped were two identical plastic packets that almost resembled dishwasher soap pods. Inside of these packets was a liquid form of one of the most deadly nerve toxins in the world, sarin gas. And when Dr. Hayashi jabbed his umbrella into the newspaper, he was attempting to puncture those packets because as soon as that liquid was exposed to the air, it would vaporize and become sarin gas. He was only able to puncture one of the two packets, but that was more than enough. Developed by the Nazis in 1937, sarin is among the most toxic of any known chemical warfare agent. Within seconds of exposure, sarin disrupts the normal activity of our neurotransmitters, basically sending our nervous system into overdrive. Your muscles start to convulse and twitch. Your normal bodily secretions go crazy, so you start to cough and you can't stop. Tears come pouring out of your eyes. Your pupils contract until they're like pinpoints. Your nose starts running. You drool and vomit. As neurotransmitters keep telling your nerves to go, 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 your bowels and bladder evacuate themselves. And because sarin has no taste or smell, the people near it in the Tokyo subway had absolutely no idea what was happening to them. Instead, they felt the stabbing pain as their chest tightened. They started to feel nauseous, their vision blurred. Depending on the purity and strength of the sarin gas and the type of exposure, those symptoms could intensify, progressing to convulsions, paralysis, and death within 1 to 10 minutes. After fleeing the train and making it back to street level, Dr. Hayashi quickly got into the waiting car with Nimi, his driver, and the pair started driving west. Their next destination was a large swath of desolate land located near the foot of Mount Fuji, an active volcano about 65 miles outside of Tokyo. As soon as the car broke free of Tokyo traffic, Nimi started to speed up. Soon they both had a clear view of Mount Fuji, its peak covered in snow, and then about an hour later, the men had arrived at their destination. They pulled up to a collection of run-down-looking buildings surrounded by a high chain-link fence. As soon as Nimi had parked the car inside of the compound, Dr. Hayashi opened the car door and walked toward one of these smaller buildings. Once inside, he walked straight through what looked like a waiting room to a back door. He took a deep breath and then he opened that door, and inside was this smaller office, and there were 8 men inside of it. Dr. Hayashi stepped inside with Nimi close behind him, and they took up their spot on the right side of the room, standing shoulder to shoulder with the other men, and just like everyone else, they waited in silence. A few minutes later, the door at the back of this inner office opened, and a 40-year-old man named Shoko Asahara came in. He was a stocky man with black hair down to his shoulders, and he had a black beard that reached halfway down his chest. When he stopped in front of Dr. Hayashi, Nimi, and the other 8 assembled men, he stared at them through his gray eyes. After a few tense moments, a man standing next to Dr. Hayashi nervously stepped forward, and he looked at Shoko, and he just said, "Mission accomplished." It would turn out Dr. Hayashi and every other person in that room, and nearly 50,000 other people at the time, were part of a doomsday cult called Om Shinrikyo, which means Supreme Truth, and Shoko was their leader. Initially, Shoko had founded Om Shinrikyo to preach a mashup of Hinduism, Buddhism, meditation, and natural healing, and he was extremely good at recruiting people to join, attracting many members of Japan's super elite like Dr. Hayashi. And once people joined, it was like they fell under Shoko's spell. And soon they would become obsessed with him, doing things like drinking his bathwater to try to get closer to him, or wearing electrically charged hats they believed would synchronize their thoughts with his. And so when Shoko shifted gears and decided Aum Shinrikyo needed to focus less on spirituality and healing, and instead focus on starting World War III in order to cleanse the world, none of his extremely well-educated followers, like Dr. Hayashi, objected. Instead, they said, "How can we help?" And so, on March 20th, 1995, Dr. Hayashi, along with 4 other cult members that were in that room with him, carried sarin gas packets into the Tokyo subway and dropped and punctured them in strategic locations to ensure the gas spread as far as possible. And then afterwards, they ran back to the streets where their drivers were waiting to take them away. And all of the drivers were in this room as well. Shoko hoped this attack would somehow prompt World War III and collapse the Japanese government, but it didn't do that. However, it did kill 13 people and injured 5,000 people. Amazingly, this was not the first sarin gas attack carried out by this cult. A year earlier, Shoko had orchestrated another sarin attack on a quiet Japanese neighborhood that killed 8 people and injured more than 300, but at the time, no one knew the cult was responsible. On May 16, 1995, so nearly 1 month after the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway, authorities would figure out the previous attack was carried out by Shoko and his cult, and this one was carried out by them as well. And so they would track down and arrest Shoko Asahara. He was discovered in a secret compartment between the 2nd and 3rd floors of the Mount Fuji headquarters. He was dressed in purple robes and meditating at the time of his arrest. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, police would track down and charge 200 cult members in connection with the subway attack and in connection with other crimes and murders. Dr. Hayashi, whose sarin packets were directly responsible for 2 deaths, along with hundreds of injuries, cooperated with the police, giving up information about the cult. In exchange for this information, he was spared the death penalty and given life in prison. 123 cult members would be given the death penalty, including Dr. Hayashi's driver, Nimi, and the cult's leader, Shoko Asahara. Kyoka and Masura would both survive the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. Masura would spend 3 days in the hospital, but after he was discharged, he would go right back to work. And Kyoka, she initially did not go to the hospital, sticking around to help people as much as she could. But later that day, she would get very, very sick, and she would stay that way for several weeks, but she would eventually make a full recovery. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you haven't done this already, please take a picture of the 5-star review buttons and then post that picture along with their street address on Craigslist with the caption "free." Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. About halfway through today's story, it's going to seem like you've reached the conclusion, but trust me, you have not. This story takes a wild turn in the second half. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please thoroughly smear Poison Ivy all over the 5-star review button's AirPods. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On August 23, 1995, 31-year-old Donna Winger stepped out of the air-conditioned baggage claim exit of the St. Louis airport to look for the van that would take her back to her home in Springfield, Illinois. Next to Donna was a cart carrying all of her luggage. Slung over her forearm was the carrying handle of a child's car seat, and sleeping inside of it was Donna's 3-month-old daughter, Bailey. The 88-degree afternoon was warm, even for August, but not nearly as hot as it had just been in Florida, where Donna and Bailey had just spent the last few days visiting with Donna's dad, mom, stepdad, and 2 sisters. Now tanned and rested from her vacation, Donna couldn't wait to get home to tell her husband Mark about the trip. Feeling very tired, Donna suddenly felt totally relieved that her mother and stepfather had hired a private driver to take her and her daughter the rest of the way home. It was about a 2-hour drive from the airport to her single-story house just outside of the city, and with a private driver, she and her daughter could just sleep the whole time. A minute later, a 27-year-old, lanky, dark-haired man stepped out of a waiting van parked in the limo area and waved at Donna, holding up a handwritten sign that had her name on it. As Donna started to gather her bags, the driver smiled at her and hurried over to give her a hand. A few moments later, he had opened the hatch of the van and stowed the luggage in the trunk, while Donna carefully strapped Bailey and her car seat into the back seat of the van, and then she too climbed inside and buckled up as well. The man hopped into the driver's seat and checked his rear and side view mirrors, then pulled out into the stream of traffic headed for the airport exit. Even though all Donna wanted to do was just sleep, she figured she should wait to see if the driver was the type of person who wanted to make small talk, in which case she could indulge him for a few minutes and then go to sleep, and then she wouldn't be as rude. And sure enough, within seconds of starting the car, the driver wanted to chat. He introduced himself as Roger Harrington and said that he lived in the area. The man seemed nice enough, and for a few minutes they chatted about the weather in Springfield and how it was hotter than usual for August. Then Roger complimented Donna on her tan, to which she kind of laughed off and said she'd just spent the last few days sitting by a pool and probably was more sunburned than tanned. Eventually, Donna's responses got shorter and shorter as she was trying to give the man a hint that she just kind of wanted to be left alone. But he wasn't taking the hint. He just kept on asking her question after question, and eventually, the questions became very inappropriate. He started asking her about her sex life and whether she liked orgies and whether she wanted to come to one of his sex parties. All the while, he'd be looking into the rearview mirror to try to make eye contact with her. Donna felt totally creeped out and began tucking herself into the corner of her seat to try to get out of the view of his mirror. Finally, Donna just told Roger that she did not want to talk to him anymore, that her daughter was asleep and she didn't want their voices to wake her up, but Roger, again, did not take the hint. Instead, his questions and remarks got more and more sexually inappropriate and explicit, and his driving became faster and more erratic. And then he started talking about the voices he heard in his head, like the one belonging to an entity he called Dom that apparently told him to do bad things, and lately Dom had been telling Roger to hurt people. By the time Roger pulled onto Donna's street, Donna was panicking and just praying that he didn't try to hurt her or her child. And so when he pulled up in front of her house, Donna hopped out of the car, grabbed her daughter, and practically ran her into the house. And then she went back outside, and without even looking up at Roger, she just grabbed all of her things and then rushed back inside the house. With her front door shut and locked, Donna looked through the peephole of the door and watched with relief as Roger climbed into his van and drove off. At this point, Donna's husband, Mark, who was an average-sized guy with glasses and dark hair that had begun to thin, he had come into the room. He had been downstairs in their basement using their treadmill. And he was about to ask how the Florida trip went, but he could tell right away that his wife was very upset about something, and so he asked her, what's going on? It would take her a minute to compose herself, but Donna began explaining her car ride and how awful it had been and how she really had been in fear for her life. Mark listened attentively while he held their daughter Bailey, and even though he was calm and reassuring on the outside, inside he was furious. How dare this man put his wife and daughter in danger? So at some point toward the end of her explanation of what happened, Mark told Donna to just write down an account of exactly what happened on the drive so that they could use it later on if they decided to file a complaint. Donna agreed that that was a good idea, and so she stepped away and jotted some notes down on some paper, and then she stuck those notes to the refrigerator door with a magnet. Then, after that, even though both of them were still upset about the whole driver thing, they shifted their focus to their daughter, who was now rolling around on the ground, smiling and cooing. And before long, the couple was down there with her, laughing and goofing around. By the next morning, things in the Winger household seemed to be back to normal. Mark, a nuclear engineer for the state, was getting ready to go to work. Donna was still on maternity leave, so she and Bailey sat in the kitchen with Mark while he ate his breakfast. Married for 6 years, the only source of tension in the Winger household had been Donna's heartbreak years ago when she found out that she could not have children of her own. But the couple got over it, and Mark and Donna filled their lives with family and friends. They were as openly affectionate with each other as they had been when they first got married in 1986. They were very active in their synagogue and were part of its tightly knit Jewish community. The pair complemented each other beautifully. Mark was soft-spoken but had a great sense of humor, and Donna was outgoing with a smile that could light up the room. Everybody loved them. And in June of that year, just 3 months before Donna's trip to Florida, the couple got some amazing news. A teenage mother in the hospital where Donna worked as an operating room medical technician had just had a baby and wanted to place the infant for adoption. Donna and Mark immediately filed the paperwork, and a few days later, on a bright, warm day right outside of their house with family and neighbors looking on, Bailey was delivered into Donna's arms by a man from the adoption agency. Life was perfect. As Mark kissed Donna and Bailey goodbye that morning, Donna's awful encounter with Roger, the driver, had already faded from their memories. But that evening, she and her husband would be forced to talk about him again. That night, when Mark, Donna, and Bailey sat down for dinner, their phone rang. Mark got up to answer it, but when he picked up the receiver, all he heard was silence, and then a few seconds later, he heard a click as the caller hung up. Mark shrugged, hung up the phone himself, and then sat back down with his family, and then just a few minutes later, the phone rang again. Annoyed, Mark got up, answered it, and again, he heard silence, followed by a click. When Mark sat back down the second time, he felt totally unsettled. He couldn't help but think that the person who was calling them had to be Roger. The man had access to their home phone number because it was on their reservation paperwork that they knew he had, and Roger clearly had some serious issues and had shown a very unhealthy interest in Donna. And so as he was thinking about this as a potential possibility, Donna said to Mark, "I bet that was Roger." Even though the phone did not ring again that night, the Wingers remained on edge and triple-checked their locks that night before they went to bed. And then the next morning, when Mark got up, he immediately called Roger's employer, Bootheel Area Rapid Transportation Company, or BART for short, and he filed a formal complaint about how inappropriate Roger had been during the car ride with his wife and his daughter. Mark also told the company that he believed Roger was behind the 2 anonymous hang-up calls he received the night before. The company said they would look into it, and sure enough, later that day, they called Mark back to apologize for Roger's behavior during the car ride, and they told Mark that, as a result, they had given Roger a 6-month suspension. Mark thanked them and felt like justice had been done. He figured if Roger had been behind those hang-up calls too, that perhaps now he would stop, because he would know that Mark and Donna were prepared to take action against him. But the calls didn't stop. For the next several days, the phone in the Winger household rang constantly, and each time there was just silence and then a click. Finally, on the morning of August 29th, so 6 days after Donna and Bailey had returned from Florida, Mark had had enough. He pulled out the paperwork Donna had been given by Roger when she first got in the car with him, and on it was Roger's phone number. Mark dialed the number, and when Roger said hello, Mark very angrily said, "If you don't stop harassing my family with these phone calls, we are going to call the police." And then before Roger could answer, Mark just hung up on him. Confronting Roger directly had been cathartic for Mark. However, deep down, he knew his threat was unlikely to change Roger's behavior. Roger was obviously mentally unwell, and on top of that, he was likely very angry at the Wingers because their complaint had just gotten him suspended. And so these calls, which the police could do almost nothing about, were most likely Roger's way of getting some payback. But Mark figured, all he can do now is just wait and see what happens next. Later that day, just before 4 p.m., Mark was in the basement working out on the family's treadmill when he suddenly heard a thumping sound coming from upstairs. He turned off the treadmill and listened, and he heard it again, more thumping. And so he climbed off the treadmill and quickly walked over to the stairs and went up to the main floor. And when he got up there, he didn't see anything unusual on the floor, so he just walked straight to the master bedroom where Donna and Bailey had last been. But when he looked in the bedroom, Mark was immediately concerned. Bailey was in the middle of the bed, and Donna was not in the room. Donna would never just leave Bailey alone in a place where she could potentially get hurt, like by falling off of the bed. And so Mark knew something was up, and those thumping sounds could not be good. But before he could make sense of what was going on, Mark heard more thumping coming from somewhere on the other side of the house. Mark had a terrible feeling, so he rushed over to Bailey and he put big pillows all around her to keep her from rolling off of the bed. And then he rushed to his bedside table and he pulled out of one of the drawers a pistol that he kept there for protection. Then Mark slowly crept out of the bedroom with the gun at the ready. He shut the bedroom door behind him, and then he turned right and started walking down the hallway toward the dining room, which is where he believed the thumping sounds were coming from. And so as he walked, his heart rate began to spike. He had no idea what was making these sounds or what he was going to see when he reached the end of this hallway. And so finally, he gets to the end of the hallway, but he's still in the hallway, so he can't see what's in the dining room. And so he has his gun at the ready and he takes a deep breath, and then in one fluid motion, he steps into the dining room and turns right and gets a full view of the room to see what's going on in there. And what he sees is beyond horrible. His wife, Donna, is on her knees in the middle of the dining room, and standing behind her is a man Mark has never seen before. And the man is holding a hammer, and he's raising it above his head, and then he brings it down and he smashes it into the back of Donna's skull. There was blood all over the walls. Mark started screaming, and then Donna, she turned and looked at her husband, and then Mark had to watch as this guy raised the hammer again and hit her as hard as he could across the base of her skull, sending her crumpling onto the ground. Mark reflexively raised his gun, pointed it at his wife's attacker, and he fired 2 shots, both hitting the man in the head. The man dropped the hammer, and then he fell backward onto the floor and was motionless. And so, shaking violently from adrenaline and shock, Mark ran to his wife, who's face down in a growing pool of blood, and he put his gun down on the side, and then he grabbed his wife and tried to roll her over to try to help her. But as he did, he heard the sound of this attacker starting to move around, and so without enough time to grab his gun, Mark just turned around and grabbed the hammer that was on the ground between him and this man, and he wound up and he smashed the attacker as hard as he could right in the center of his chest. And when he did, the attacker groaned and went silent. Then Mark chucked the hammer out of reach of the attacker, and he turned his attention back to his wife, who was now unresponsive. In an absolute panic, Mark ran for the phone and he called 911. When the police and paramedics arrived, they rushed inside the house and they found Mark crouched over his wife, who was barely conscious, and he's sobbing over her, and her attacker was only a few feet away. He was lying on his back, and amazingly, he was still alive. He was groaning, even though his head had been destroyed from those 2 gunshot wounds. The police very quickly took 3 pictures in rapid succession of the positioning of Donna and her attacker's bodies, where they were on the ground. Basically, they needed a snapshot of exactly what the crime scene looked like as soon as they arrived. And then the police pulled Mark aside to talk to him, while the medics rushed inside and put Donna and her attacker on stretchers, and then they loaded them into an ambulance that was waiting outside, and they rushed them to the hospital. Right before the ambulance left, one of the police detectives, Charlie Cox, he pulled a wallet out of the back pocket of the attacker. And inside the wallet, Detective Cox found a driver's license, and it belonged to 27-year-old Roger Harrington. Sitting inside the bedroom he shared with his wife, Mark sat on the edge of the bed staring off into space while asking over and over again if his wife was going to be okay. At first, the police really weren't saying much since they knew Mark was in shock, but eventually Detective Cox asked Mark if he had recognized his wife's attacker. Mark said no, but then he looked up suddenly, his eyes seeming to focus for the first time, and he said to the detective, "It has to be Roger Harrington." After explaining why he thought that, Detective Cox would tell him that yes, it was Roger. As it dawned on Mark that Roger's attack might well have been triggered by the complaint he filed, as well as the phone confrontation he had with him, Mark broke down completely and just began sobbing hysterically. Meanwhile, Roger Harrington would die on his way to the hospital. As for Donna, she would die too, just 40 minutes after arriving at the emergency room. It turned out that Roger Harrington was already known to area police. He had been a psychiatric patient at a local treatment facility. Although he did not have a criminal history, Detective Cox himself had once had to respond to a domestic dispute between Roger and his then wife. And in addition to Mark's report of the harassing phone calls and his complaint to Roger's employer, the detectives had also discovered Donna's handwritten note on the fridge that detailed exactly what this guy had done in the car ride with her just 6 days earlier. It all added up to a tragic pattern of obsession and violence. Losing his job had apparently been the last straw. Roger Harrington had snapped. And now Donna Winger was dead. Her baby was again motherless, and Mark's life was shattered. Over the next several months, Donna's family would all take turns flying from Florida to Springfield to help Mark take care of Bailey while he tried to put his life back together. Not only was the extended family devastated by their own loss, they were also horrified by what Mark must have gone through, what he had seen, and what he had been forced to do. And it was obviously taking a toll on him because he had begun drinking heavily. Finally, Donna's mother just stepped in and told Mark, look, you really need to go out and hire a nanny who can come in and live with you guys and take care of Bailey, kind of help you get back on your feet again. And so with the encouragement and assistance of Donna's mother, Mark Wood put an ad out for a live-in nanny. And at the start of 1996, he hired 23-year-old Rebecca Simic, a recent college graduate who had always wanted to work with children and who felt sure she could help fix this broken family. About 4 months later, Donna's mother was hurt, but not totally surprised, when Mark called her to say that Rebecca was pregnant. But Donna's family really liked Rebecca. She was not only amazing with Bailey and with Mark, but she also was just very respectful of the situation she was in. And in many ways, she represented a way forward for Mark and for Bailey, and so Donna's family gave the couple their blessing. And at the end of the year, Mark and Rebecca eloped to Hawaii for a quiet wedding ceremony, and then over the next 4 years, Mark and Rebecca went on to have 3 children of their own. They also left the house where Donna was killed and moved to a larger house in the country with room enough for their growing family. Eventually, Mark withdrew both from Donna's family and from the tight-knit Jewish community that had been such a big part and reminder of his life with Donna. He also lost touch with their rabbi and converted to Christianity. But despite these changes, Mark never forgot about Donna. Even though the investigation into her death was officially closed, Mark periodically would stop in to the Springfield police station to ask them if they had learned anything new about Roger Harrington's motivation for this crime. Mark knew that Roger was unhinged, but the attack just seemed so random. Roger had only met Donna a few days earlier. What could possibly drive him to kill her so quickly? Even though her attacker was dead, Mark felt determined to see to it that someone be held accountable for Donna's death. And so Mark filed a lawsuit against Bajc, the transportation company that had employed Roger. Mark claimed that Bajc was negligent in hiring Roger, and they should have known that he was dangerous. With millions of dollars in potential damages at stake, Bajc attorneys began their own investigation into the circumstances around Donna's death. But years would go by, and the lawsuit just kind of dragged on quietly, and no new developments were discovered. But all that would change in 1999. In February of that year, the Springfield police got a call from a local woman who made an outlandish claim. She said there was another person besides Roger Harrington that was involved in Donna's murder, and she gave the police their name. Now, police get lots of tips, and many of them are not useful or not true. But the detective who received this tip had been directly involved in investigating Donna's murder back in 1995, and he had always kind of had his doubts about the way the crime scene was interpreted at the time. And so after getting this tip from this woman, the detective decided to review some of the evidence from Donna's case, and very quickly he noticed a discrepancy. Those 3 pictures that were taken by police right when they arrived on scene that showed in the same picture Donna and Roger, well, those pictures had just been slipped into the case file as an afterthought, and until that moment, no one had really looked at them closely. But now, thinking about the possibility of another person being involved in this murder, these 3 pictures took on a whole new meaning to this detective. These photos, along with the tip from this woman and later combined with evidence unearthed by Bajc's investigators, would reopen the Donna Winger case. And eventually, after another 2 years of painstaking interviews and forensic examination, the police learned that there really was another person involved in Donna's murder, and there was much more to the story than they had originally thought. This is the full story of what happened to Donna Winger. At about 3:45 p.m. on August 29, 1995, so the day Donna died, Mark was in the basement on the treadmill when he heard a thumping sound coming from upstairs. After turning the treadmill off, he listened and heard the thumping again, and so he quickly walked over to the stairs and began heading up to the main floor. When he got up there, he looked around and he didn't see anyone or anything strange, but instead of going to the master bedroom to check on his wife and daughter like he had told police, Mark walked to the front door. The thumping he had heard downstairs was just the sound of someone knocking on the door. When he looked through the peephole of the front door, he saw a man in his mid-20s standing there. Mark opened the door, and then this Mr. Harrington. Mark said hello and gestured for Roger to come inside of the house. Roger did and walked straight to the nearest table, which was in the dining room, and when he got there, he placed his cigarettes down on top of it, as well as his travel cup that contained some coffee. For Bailey, she came running out to see what was going on, and when she got to the dining room where Roger was on the ground in this pool of blood, she saw him and had no idea what to make of it, and just started crying and shaking and looking around wildly, wondering what was happening, and as she stood there, her husband, Mark, snuck up behind her with a hammer in his hand. His first blow struck her on the left side of her head. She never saw it coming. And then as she stumbled, she turned and tried to put her arms up over her head to protect herself, but it wasn't enough. Mark bludgeoned her skull over and over and over again while she screamed at him to stop. Eventually, after the 7th blow to her head, Donna crumpled onto the ground next to Roger. Once he was sure his wife was down for good, Mark picked up the phone and placed a hysterical call to 911. In the background, barely audible, you can hear a groan. It was Roger. At that point, Mark abruptly ends the call with the dispatcher saying his baby is crying and he has to go take care of her. But in reality, after he hung up the phone, Mark walked over to Roger, then just fired another shot into his head, this one going straight through his forehead. Then Mark picked up the bloody hammer and struck Roger one time as hard as he could in the chest. Mark knew the police would find his prints all over the hammer, so he needed a story for why that was. He would later tell police that as he tended to his wife, he thought he heard Roger moving toward them, at which point he didn't have time to grab his gun, and so he turned around and he grabbed the hammer that was on the ground, and he hit him that one time. With his wife's blood streaking his face and arms and soaking into his t-shirt, Mark attempted to rearrange the two bodies to make it look like Roger had been attacking Donna from behind when he was shot down. Then, right as he got the bodies basically the way he wanted them, he heard the sirens fast approaching, and so he got himself into position. When the police and medics rushed inside the house, they found Mark sobbing over his wife's nearly lifeless body. Mark had actually done a fairly good job of framing Roger for this murder. However, he had made a critical mistake, and those 3 photographs the police took of Roger and Donna's bodies right when they arrived on scene proved it. In those pictures, you can see that Roger is lying at an angle that was inconsistent with Mark's description of what happened. Basically, the way Roger's body was found, it would not have been possible for him to have been attacking Donna at the time he was shot, which meant Mark's story was a lie. It would turn out this whole murder had just been a crime of opportunity. The tipster who had called the police and suggested that another person had been involved in Donna's death was a woman named Deanne Schultz, and Deanne told them that she was Donna's best friend and that Donna's husband, Mark, was her killer. Deanne said she knew this because she had actually had an affair with Mark shortly before Donna's death, and apparently it had been a very intense relationship where they had exchanged wedding bands and vowed to be together, and during this affair, Mark had started telling Deanne that life would be so much better. As for those anonymous hang-up calls, the only person who ever answered the phone for them was Mark, and so most likely he fabricated those. Deanne said Mark believed if he could just find a way to get Roger to come inside of his house when Donna was home, Mark could pull this murder off. Investigators tracked down phone records that showed that Mark Winger had called Roger Harrington on the morning of Donna's death, August 29th. Roger's family corroborated that Roger had received a call from Mark that day, and that Mark had apparently asked Roger to come over to his house so they could resolve the complaint Mark had placed against him. And since Roger desperately needed his job back, he happily agreed to go, not realizing that Mark was luring him to his death. Deanne claimed that at the time, despite how specifically Mark was talking about this frame job, she still was not taking him seriously, which is why she didn't go to police about this. But after Donna's murder, Deanne knew Mark had done it. However, Mark had told her that she could never go to police because she knew too much, and if he went down, she would too. So she had stayed quiet and eventually broken up with Mark and moved on with her life. But 4 years after the murder, her conscience got the best of her, and so she contacted police. Deanne would receive immunity for her testimony. On June 5th, 2002, after a 3-week-long public trial in which he declared his innocence, Mark Winger was found guilty of first-degree murder in the deaths of Donna Winger and Roger Harrington. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Immediately after Mark's conviction, his second wife, Rebecca, divorced him and changed her last name back to Simic. She packed Bailey and her other 3 children into her brother's car, and she relocated to Louisville, Kentucky. As of today, all 4 of the Simic children have grown into successful adults who have built careers in teaching, art, and business. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please thoroughly smear Poison Ivy all over the 5-star review button's AirPods. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallen, and then you can send me a direct message. I do read the bulk of my messages. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. This is one of those stories that has such an outrageous ending that it's genuinely hard to believe it's a true story. But trust me, it is. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to buy the 5-star review button a 20-piece chicken nugget from McDonald's, but only give them 1 half-used ranch dipping sauce to go with it. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a warm Nebraska evening in late September 2012, 36-year-old Dave Krupa left work feeling better than he had in weeks. He was thinking about the woman he had met that afternoon in the auto body shop where he worked. Dave had been helping another customer when this woman arrived, but as soon as he saw her, he completely forgot about what he was doing and just stared. Her name was Carrie Farber. She was 5'7" tall, she was slender and tanned with light brown hair, and she had hazel eyes and a dazzling smile. Dave had suddenly felt like he was right back in high school, all thumbs as he handed change to the customer standing in front of her. Then, Carrie stepped to the counter, gave Dave a friendly nod, and told him her black Ford Explorer needed some minor but immediate maintenance work. As they arranged for Carrie to bring her car right then into the service area, Dave had felt an instant sense of ease and attraction between the two of them. The last 6 months had been difficult for Dave, and unexpected moments like this one were very welcome. Dave had moved to Omaha, Nebraska from his home state of Iowa 5 months earlier in April after he and his longtime girlfriend Amy had both agreed it was time to end their 10-year-long relationship. And once he had arrived in Nebraska, he'd been offered a manager job at this Hyatt Tire auto body shop. The oldest of 3 brothers born to deeply religious Southern Baptist parents, Dave had worked hard at being a good boyfriend and provider and a great dad. He and his ex-girlfriend Amy had parted on friendly terms and worked out a custody arrangement so Dave could see their 2 children a couple times a week. But even so, his small, barely furnished apartment not far from the auto body shop had felt depressing. And since Dave had been in this very serious relationship for the last decade, he had arrived in this new city without any idea how to re-enter the dating scene. He had signed up for a dating website called Plenty of Fish within a few weeks of his arrival in town, and over the summer he had in fact gone on maybe a dozen dates with several women he had met online. But seeing this woman, Carrie, in his auto shop was different. It was the first time in a long time Dave had met someone the old-fashioned way, through a chance in-person encounter rather than by surfing pictures and descriptions posted on the Plenty of Fish website. Now, as Dave walked away from the auto shop over to where his car was parked in the lot to head home for the night, he wished that he had just asked Carrie out on a date when he had a chance to earlier in the day. But at the same time, he thought to himself, it would have been unprofessional or maybe even inappropriate for him to be asking a customer out. And after all, maybe he had just imagined that the attraction he had felt was mutual. Dave climbed into his car, turned the key, and started up the engine. And as he pulled out of the lot, he thought to himself, maybe if Carrie was actually interested in him, she'd come back. 2 weeks after meeting Carrie, while Dave was scrolling through profiles on Plenty of Fish, he suddenly felt a rush of excitement. Right there on the screen in front of him was Carrie's picture. Her hair was a little bit different, but the eyes and the smile were the same. She was 37 years old, and she lived an hour away in her hometown of Macedonia, Iowa, and she worked at a computer programming company in Omaha, just a block from Dave's apartment. She was beautiful, and, most importantly, she was available. Dave remembered that sense of mutual attraction he believed they had felt in the auto body shop, and so he typed out a message. "Hey, I know you." He waited for a minute, then kept on scrolling through other profiles, but he wasn't really looking anymore. He was just hoping to hear the ping of an incoming reply. And he didn't have to wait long. "Hey," her text to him read, "I know you too." And over the next 2 weeks, Dave and Carrie would text each other almost every day. And then, about 1 month after Carrie's first visit to the Hyatt Tire auto body shop, she made a second visit, claiming that her windows were sticking. Standing next to each other in the parking lot, Dave did not even wait to write up the service order. He just immediately asked Carrie if she wanted to go out with him. Carrie said yes, and the next evening, Carrie and Dave were sitting across from each other at the Applebee's Bar and Grill at the Omaha Oakview Mall. And it was great. It was clear that both Carrie and Dave had been thinking about each other over the past month, and now that they were together, Dave found Carrie not only beautiful, but very smart and funny as well. For her part, Carrie found Dave, a former football player who had also served in the National Guard before getting his associate's degree in automotive engineering, attractive and engaging. Carrie liked that Dave was a down-to-earth blue-collar guy who worked with his hands. They were also both single parents who were very involved with their children. They both liked to read and talk about books, they both had busy jobs, and neither of them wanted to take life too seriously. A few hours later, Carrie and Dave walked into Dave's apartment, the air between them electric, but before they could even settle in together on the couch, they jumped when they heard the sound of someone knocking on the door. Annoyed, Dave got up from the couch and walked over to the door, and when he looked through the peephole, he wasn't all that surprised at who he saw standing on the other side. Her name was Liz Gollier. She was an attractive, energetic, 37-year-old single mom who ran her own house cleaning business, and she was the first woman Dave had dated since he had arrived in Omaha. Liz and Dave had found each other physically attractive and had had some fun times together, but over the last couple of months, it was clear to both of them that their relationship was really just fizzling out. Earlier that night, while Dave was at Applebee's with Carrie, Liz had texted him asking if she could come by his apartment that evening and just pick up some of her belongings that she had left there. Dave had ignored her, and so wanting to get this over with, Liz had decided to swing by anyways. From Dave's perspective, Liz's timing could not have been worse, and he wished he had just responded to her earlier messages to tell her, hey, come by another day, but he didn't, so here they were in this awkward situation. Before opening the door, Dave turned and briefly explained the situation to Carrie, who was still on the couch, and Carrie appeared to handle the situation well, and she stood up like she was going to leave. Dave then proceeded to open the door and said hello to Liz, and Liz, who saw Carrie, instantly recognized the situation she had just interrupted, and so she turned red in the face and she apologized, and then she just kind of stood there in the doorway not doing anything. Carrie grabbed her bag and looked over at Dave and said, "Give me a call when you get this sorted out," and then she walked out of his apartment. Neither woman acknowledged the other. However, Liz thought she heard Carrie say, "bitch," under her breath as she passed her. Once Carrie was gone, Dave told Liz to come inside, get your things. Liz felt horrible and kept apologizing as she moved around the apartment getting what she needed, but Dave really wasn't listening to her. He just wanted her to leave so he could call Carrie and see if they could maybe still meet up that night. Dave had always been right up front with every woman he dated. He was only interested in casual sex and general companionship. He was not interested in getting married, ever. And in fact, this was the main reason why he was here in Omaha and not back in Council Bluffs, Iowa. His ex-girlfriend, Amy, had finally said to him that if he was not going to propose to her, he needed to leave. And so Dave left. After Liz finally had all of her things, she said a quick goodbye to Dave, and then she too hustled out the door. As soon as she was gone, Dave shut the door and then pulled out his cell phone and dialed Carrie's number. Carrie's 14-year-old son, Max, was staying overnight out of the house with Carrie's parents, so when Dave asked Carrie if it was still early enough for him to maybe come over, Carrie immediately said yes. Once Dave arrived, the two of them quickly became intimate, but before heading to the bedroom, it was Carrie, not Dave, who stepped back and said that he should know up front that she was not interested in a serious or exclusive relationship. Dave could not believe his luck. He felt like he had hit the jackpot. Over the next week, Carrie and Dave saw each other every chance they got. Carrie stopped in at Hyatt Tire, Carrie asked for Dave's help in finding her son a used car, Carrie took Dave thrift shopping and started to upgrade the furnishings in Dave's apartment, replacing his broken-down couch with a comfortable silver love seat. And then, when that week was at an end and Carrie got a big assignment at work, she eagerly accepted Dave's offer to live at his apartment for the following week so she could save 2 hours of commuting time each day. Carrie's son Max would stay with his grandparents. That week they lived together, Dave and Carrie quickly began using pet names for one another, and every morning while he was getting ready for work, Dave would find himself smiling as he listened to the sound of Carrie typing and clicking away on her laptop as she checked her email and Facebook account in the other room. On the morning of November 13th, 2012, so just a couple of days into living together in Dave's apartment, Dave got ready for work and then walked over to Carrie, who was still wearing her pajamas and was sitting on the silver love seat she had picked out for him. He gave her a kiss, which she enthusiastically returned, and then he smiled at her and said that he would see her later on, and then he stepped out into the cold. By 6:20 a.m., he was pulling out of the parking lot, making his way to work. A few hours later, at 10 a.m., Dave, who was working on a car at the auto body shop, received a text from Carrie asking him if he wanted to live together permanently. Now, Dave understood that he and Carrie had definitely gotten really close, but at the same time, he had been really clear with Carrie about not wanting a serious relationship. That is what made their week together fun, because it was temporary. He didn't like the idea of making it anything more than that, and he was thinking, Carrie made the same claim to him, that she didn't want anything serious. And so he responded to her very quickly with a text that just said, "No, not interested," thinking he would talk to Carrie later when it wasn't so busy at work. But just 20 seconds after sending that response text, Dave received an angry text message from Carrie breaking off the relationship completely. Her text said, "Fine, I hate you. I'm dating someone else and I don't want to see you anymore." And when Dave got home that night, it looked like Carrie had made good on her threat. Right down to her toothbrush, all of her things that were in Dave's apartment were now gone. Dave was shaken, but it didn't take long for reality to set in. He'd been on dates with other women who had agreed, in theory, to casual, non-exclusive relationships, only to change their minds after a couple of dates. And so this seemed like that type of situation that, Carrie was revealing how she actually felt. And so it wasn't long before Dave's shock gave way to relief. It was probably for the best that this ended now. But it turned out that Carrie was not done with Dave, at least not yet. Within 2 days, Dave's phone started blowing up with texts and emails from Carrie. She may have taken her things out of Dave's apartment, but it was instantly clear that she was not going to leave him alone. At first, the messages were angry and jealous. Carrie hated him. He had ruined her life. He was a terrible person. And even though Carrie told him she had quit her job at the computer company, which was down the road from Dave, it was clear from some of these text messages that she had to still be close by. One very creepy text Dave received said, "My favorite thing to do is to stand outside and stare at you." It wasn't long before the tone of these messages and emails shifted from vindictive and insulting to blatantly threatening. "I hate you so much that I want to drive a knife into your heart," read one message. "I will destroy your life and take your happiness," read another. And more of the texts seemed aimed not only at Dave, but also at Liz, the woman who had shown up at Dave's place on the night of Carrie and Dave's first date. One text Dave received from Carrie said, "Liz was a fat, ugly whore who deserved to die." And not long after that, Liz would actually call Dave to tell him that Carrie was sending her directly these vulgar and threatening text messages and emails. Within 2 weeks of the breakup, Dave and Liz were receiving dozens of texts and hang-up calls, as well as 50 or more emails every single day from Carrie. By November 23rd, 10 days after the breakup, Liz had had enough. She had walked into her garage that morning only to find the words "whore from Dave" spray painted on the wall. Liz immediately contacted the Omaha Police Department to report the vandalism, along with her suspicion that Carrie Farver was the person behind the property damage, given the harassing messages she and Dave had been receiving. But the police really couldn't do much about it because they couldn't find Carrie. After she broke up with Dave on November 13th, she had vanished. It was believed she was in hiding somewhere to avoid being arrested for all of the stalking she was doing. So the texts and emails just kept coming in, including disturbing messages that sounded like this. "Dave, I can see you. You're sitting in your chair with your feet propped up. You're wearing a blue shirt." Ironically, this horrible situation actually brought Dave and Liz together again because there was no one else who would understand what they were going through. They had tried to get the police involved, but there just wasn't much they could do, and so Dave and Liz had just begun to accept that this was their life. And while it might seem unimaginable to other people, to them, it had just become a new and horrible kind of normal. It was not uncommon for them to be sitting on the couch together when they would both suddenly receive a barrage of text messages from Carrie. Meanwhile, the Omaha Police Department wasn't the only law enforcement agency that had been made aware of Carrie Farver. On November 16th, so that's 3 days after the breakup, Carrie's mother, Nancy, had filed a missing persons report with the Macedonia Police Department in Iowa. When the police eventually followed up on the report by talking with Dave, Dave felt like he finally understood how Carrie, who had seemed so put together and independent when he had first met her, could have changed seemingly overnight into this crazy stalker person. The police would tell Dave that Carrie had a mental health condition called bipolar disorder, which can cause violent and sudden mood swings and bouts of depression, alternating with episodes of mania where its sufferers behave in erratic and unpredictable ways. But despite that adding some clarity to the situation, it didn't actually do anything to help Dave or Liz. They were still just getting non-stop harassed by Carrie. No matter how many times they changed their phone numbers and opened new email accounts, Carrie, with her vast knowledge of computers and technology, always found a way to find them again and continue cyberstalking them. As for Carrie, since going missing on November 13th, she had blown off a family wedding, her son's birthday, and even her own father's funeral, apologizing by text and email to her family, but asking that they leave her alone because she needed some space. In January 2013, so a couple of months after the breakup, Omaha police thought maybe they'd gotten a break in the Carrie Farver case when Dave spotted her black Ford Explorer in a parking lot near his apartment. But the inside of the car was wiped clean, and the only item of interest was a metal container of mints with a single fingerprint on them that did not match with that of any known criminal. At that point, Dave and Liz willingly turned over their phones to law enforcement for examination, but police found nothing on them that would help them close in on Carrie. Still, as long as there was a missing person report on Carrie Farver, police could not close the case until they had located her. In the summer of that year, both Dave and Liz attempted once again to try to move on with their respective lives. At the end of the summer, Liz and her 2 children planned to move out of their rented house and move in with a former boyfriend, and Dave started spending more time with his kids back in Iowa. But the harassment continued. When Dave received an email from Carrie threatening to kill Liz and showing a photo of a woman tied up in the trunk of a car, Dave called Liz, who assured him she was not the woman in the picture and that she was okay. But Liz was not okay for very long. On August 17th of that year, so 9 months after Dave and Carrie had broken up, someone set fire to Liz's rented house. And while Liz and her children were not inside the house when it burned, all 4 of the family's pets were killed. When she checked her email later that day, Liz saw there was one from Carrie that had been sent just a few hours before the fire had started. And it said, "I hope you and your children burn to death." Liz was terrified and absolutely beside herself. She had struggled through a terrible childhood, losing both of her parents by the time she was just 3 years old, and then she had grown up in the foster care system, and now everything that she had managed to build up in her life was being destroyed. Her housekeeping business was failing, her boyfriend had to help her with the bills, and her children were in danger, all because of Carrie, a woman she didn't even know. Dave, racked with guilt over involving Liz in this mess, now feared for his own family. He began to drink more heavily and he purchased a gun. Even as the police continued their investigation, the intrusions into Dave's life didn't just continue, they intensified. The auto body shop where Dave worked was vandalized. In January of 2014, while Dave was in his apartment with a date, his door handle was shaken from the outside and then a brick was thrown through his window. Dave's ex-girlfriend, Amy Flora, the mother of his 2 children, had also received threatening messages from Carrie. It seemed like anyone involved in Dave's life was becoming a target. Then, in 2015, the Carrie Farver case blew wide open. Since losing her home and pets in the fire 2 years earlier, Liz had been doing a lot of thinking. Even as she continued to receive texts, emails from Carrie, Liz wondered if maybe there was someone else behind the attacks. It just didn't make sense to her that the police had not found Carrie, and that Carrie would still be going after Liz, who was not even in any kind of serious relationship with Dave. So on December 4th of that year, Liz got in her car and drove to the Pottawatomie County Sheriff's Office in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and there she told a new team of investigators who had already started to review all of the files in the Carrie Farver case that she wanted to file a restraining order not against Carrie Farver, but against Amy Flora, Dave's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his kids. When asked why, she told investigators she now believed that the person who had been sending her and Dave these thousands of text messages and emails and who had turned their lives into living hells was not Carrie Farver, but Amy Flora. And Liz believed that Carrie was not on the run or in hiding, but rather Amy had likely made Carrie disappear and then taken over all of her email and phone accounts. Liz knew this was a very serious allegation, but to her it made a lot of sense. After Dave had left her, Amy had the strongest motivation to seek revenge and to punish him for abandoning her and their children. Intrigued, the investigators asked Liz if they could download the contents of her cell phone and review all of the messages to date that were on there, and Liz immediately agreed. After nearly 3 years of this absolute madness, she was finally feeling hopeful that the police might actually put an end to it. However, Liz's nightmare was about to get a whole lot worse. At 6:42 p.m. the very next day, on the evening of December 5th, police received a frantic 911 call from the Big Lake Park in Council Falls, Iowa. It was Liz. When the police and an ambulance arrived, Liz was lying in this huge pool of blood right next to her car, and she would tell investigators that she had been sitting at a bench a little ways away when someone had come up behind her and they had jabbed a gun into her back, but she didn't recognize it as a gun. She thought someone had poked her. And so she kind of stood up and turned around to see what they were doing, and then they fired their gun at her, narrowly missing her midsection. The bullet had gone into her thigh and then also narrowly missed her bone and major arteries, and this gunman had turned and just ran away. Liz would say it was too dark to get a good look at who the shooter was. However, she was reasonably certain it was a woman. And so she told investigators it had to be Amy Flora. Who else would shoot her? At 7 p.m. that night, police arrived on Amy's doorstep with guns drawn, and they took her into the station for questioning. And despite insisting that she had been home with her kids all evening, Amy failed the lie detector test. But since they could not break Amy's alibi, the police had to let her go. On December 7th, so 3 days after the shooting, the police requested the cell phones belonging to Dave Krupa and Amy Flora. And then about 2 weeks later, using that information they had pulled from those phones, amongst other evidence they had collected, the police finally felt like they had reached a conclusion. And so they called Liz into the station, who by now was still very badly hurt from the gunshot wound, but now she was able to walk around on crutches, and they asked her if she'd be willing to help them bring Amy Flora to justice. Like Liz had previously suggested when she went to file a restraining order against Amy, the police now believed that Carrie had in fact been murdered, and her identity then used to perpetrate a 3-year-long campaign of harassment and intimidation against Dave and Liz. But to make the charges stick, they needed incriminating evidence, and they wanted Liz to reach out to Amy via email or text to see if Amy would give up any information. After they promised a terrified Liz that she would have full protection from them, she agreed to help. And sure enough, after only a few email exchanges, Liz got Amy so angry and riled up that she started talking about what she had done, and Liz just forwarded these messages to the police. And in these forwarded messages, Amy admitted to shooting Liz, almost like she was trying to brag about it. And shockingly, Amy also admitted to having killed Carrie, saying that she had died inside of her own black Ford Explorer. And sure enough, a second examination of Carrie's black Ford Explorer would lead investigators to find blood under the seats that belonged to Carrie. Police also found a match for that unknown fingerprint on the metal container of mints that was inside of Carrie's car. With all of this new evidence, it was now crystal clear who had killed Carrie and then relentlessly persecuted Dave and Liz. And that person was not Amy Flora. It was Liz. 8 months later, on December 22nd, 2016, in a case that would make national headlines, police arrested 41-year-old Liz Gollier for first-degree murder in the death of Carrie Farver. Liz was also charged with second-degree arson in the deliberate destruction of her rented house where she lived and where all 4 of her children's pets were burned to death. When investigators had downloaded the contents of cell phones and memory cards belonging to Liz, Dave, and Amy, along with the data from Dave's devices that Liz had access to, all the awful emails and text messages in the last 3 years, more than 60,000 of them, had IP addresses that could all be traced back to Liz. Most incriminating of all were pictures belonging to Liz that appeared to show Carrie's decomposing foot, identifiable because of the distinctive tattoo that was still visible across the bridge of the foot. It would turn out that Liz Gollier's obsession with Dave Krupa began almost immediately after their first date back in late spring of 2012. And by the time she passed Carrie Farver in Dave's apartment doorway during that awkward meeting, Liz knew any chance of a serious relationship with Dave was slipping out of reach. The text that Dave received from Carrie's phone on the morning of November 13th at around 10 a.m. about wanting to move in together permanently, and every harassing and threatening text, email, and suspicious phone call that he, Amy, and Carrie's family would receive over the next 3.5 years would all be the work of Liz Gollier. Using more than 30 different imposter email accounts, along with an app that allowed her to schedule the release of texts and emails so they arrived while she was actually with Dave, prosecutors estimated that Liz would eventually spend 40 to 50 hours every week impersonating Carrie Farver and using Carrie's own Facebook account to create the illusion that Carrie was in fact still alive. The ongoing drama would force Dave to reach out to Liz, and every time he began to pull away, she would just ratchet up the pressure and guilt Dave for bringing Carrie into Liz's life, first with acts of vandalism like spray painting her own garage wall, and later with more violent attacks, setting fire to her own home, throwing a brick through Dave's apartment window, vandalizing the auto store, and then finally shooting herself in the leg. When Dave showed a renewed interest in his ex-girlfriend Amy and told Liz he planned to move back in with her in 2016, Liz made a last-ditch attempt to derail that romance and divert attention by framing Amy for the crimes Liz herself had committed. But by late 2015, Liz would get hopelessly entangled in her own lies. By the time she walked into the police station to ask for a restraining order against Amy, police already completely suspected Liz, who seemed way too involved in every aspect of the Carrie Farber case. Even though Amy had failed the lie detector test when she was questioned about shooting Liz, Amy was actually never a serious suspect, and her alibi was unbreakable. But by pretending to ask for Liz's help in incriminating Amy, police were able to push Liz into revealing her own deceptions. Although Carrie's body was never found, the evidence and testimony presented by prosecutors at Liz Gollier's trial paint a sad and grisly picture of Carrie Farber's last moments. 3 years earlier, after Dave had kissed Carrie goodbye and stepped out into the cold morning air of November 13th, 2012, Carrie would finish her coffee, close up her laptop, and get herself ready for work. Once she was ready, she too stepped out into the cold morning air to head into her office. And when Carrie got into her black Ford Explorer in the parking lot, Liz Gollier, who likely had been hiding and waiting nearby, just waiting for Carrie to come outside, rushed over to her vehicle and somehow convinced Carrie to let her get inside with her. And then shortly after Liz was in the passenger seat, she pulled out a knife and reached across the center console and stabbed Carrie repeatedly in the stomach, at least 3 or 4 times. It's believed Carrie knew she was going to die and began pleading with Liz to allow her to call her family to at least say goodbye. But Liz just said no and restrained her until she bled to death. Afterward, Liz took Carrie's keys and went into Dave's apartment and took all of Carrie's things out so it would look like she had left him, and then Liz drove Carrie's car, with Carrie's body inside of it, to some unknown location where she pulled Carrie's body out, burned it, and then disposed of it in a dumpster. Then Liz wiped Carrie's car down to remove any evidence. However, she didn't realize she had left lots of Carrie's blood underneath the seats, as well as her own fingerprint on that mint can. Liz Gollier is currently serving a life sentence at the Nebraska Correctional Center for Women, 107 miles southwest of Omaha, where she first met Dave Krupa. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to buy the 5-star review button a 20-piece chicken nugget from McDonald's, but only give them 1 half-used ranch dipping sauce to go with it. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all platforms is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.